The gestation pod containing the infant Primarch, designated as the eighth son of the Emperor, crashed into the industrial nightmare of Nostramo with the force of a meteor. Its adamantium shell scarred, but intact after its violent passage through the warp storm that had scattered the Primarch infants across the galaxy. The pod's impact crater smoldered in the depths of Nostramo Quintus, the planet's most decrepit and lawless hive city, where the weak light of the dying sun barely penetrated the towering spires of corroded metal and crumbling rockcrete that stretched endlessly into the polluted sky. Nostramo itself was a world consumed by perpetual twilight, its sun a fading ember that cast everything in shades of gray and black. The planet's surface was dominated by massive hive cities built upon the bones of exhausted mining operations, their foundations sunk deep into the planet's crust, where generations of workers had extracted adamantium and other precious metals until the veins ran dry. What remained was a hollow shell of a world, its population crammed into vertical cities that rose like metal mountains from the scarred landscape, their lower levels lost in permanent darkness. The infant Primarch emerged from his damaged pod into this world of shadows and violence, his pale skin already adapted to the dim light that would define his existence. Unlike his brothers who were discovered by kings, nobles, or warrior tribes, Konrad Curze found himself alone in the Underhive, the deepest and most dangerous levels of Nostramo Quintus, where the dregs of humanity fought for survival among the rusted pipes and abandoned machinery of the city's forgotten infrastructure. The Underhive was a realm unto itself, a three-dimensional maze of collapsed tunnels, makeshift settlements, and criminal territories where the rule of law had never existed. Here, in the perpetual darkness broken only by the occasional flicker of stolen power cells or the glow of toxic waste, the most desperate and violent elements of Nostramo's population carved out their existence through murder, theft, and exploitation. Gang warfare was constant, with territories measured in city blocks and held through brutal intimidation. The weak were preyed upon without mercy, and survival depended on one's willingness to inflict violence upon others. Into this environment, the infant Primarch was thrust with nothing but his superhuman constitution and the strange gift that would define his existence, the ability to perceive fragments of the future through psychic visions that came to him as waking nightmares. Even as a child, Konrad experienced these prophetic glimpses as vivid, overwhelming sensations that showed him scenes of death, suffering, and betrayal with crystalline clarity. These visions were not gentle premonitions, but violent intrusions into his consciousness, forcing him to witness atrocities that had not yet occurred, but were inevitable components of the dark future that awaited humanity. The young Primarch's survival in the Underhive was a testament to both his enhanced physiology and his rapidly developing cunning. His pale skin, black eyes, and preternatural awareness marked him as different from the other feral children who scavenged in the depths, but it was his ability to anticipate danger through his psychic gift that truly set him apart. He learned to trust his visions, using them to avoid the gangs that would have killed him for sport, and to find sources of food and shelter in the hostile environment. As Konrad grew, his visions became more frequent and more detailed, showing him not just immediate threats, but broader patterns of corruption and violence that permeated Nostramo's society. He witnessed murders that would not occur for days or weeks, saw the faces of victims and perpetrators with perfect clarity, and experienced the pain and terror of those who would suffer at the hands of the planet's criminal elements. These visions were not abstract prophecies, but visceral experiences that left him physically and emotionally scarred, as if he had personally endured every atrocity he foresaw. The constant bombardment of these dark visions shaped Konrad's psychological development in profound ways. Unlike his brother Primarchs who were raised by loving adoptive families or noble mentors, Konrad had only his visions as companions, and they were companions that brought him nothing but knowledge of humanity's capacity for cruelty. He learned to view the world through the lens of inevitable suffering, seeing every person he encountered as either a future victim or a future perpetrator of violence. This perspective, combined with his isolation from normal human contact, created a worldview that was fundamentally pessimistic and focused on the darker aspects of human nature. The transformation from survivor to vigilante, began when Konrad reached adolescence, and his physical capabilities had developed to the point where he could act upon the knowledge his visions provided. The first criminal he killed was a gang leader named Varkesh the Flenser, a sadistic murderer who controlled a significant portion of the Underhive's flesh trade. Konrad had witnessed Varkesh's future crimes in excruciating detail through his visions, seeing the gang leader torture and kill dozens of innocent people over the coming months. Armed with this knowledge, Konrad stalked Varkesh through the Underhive's twisted passages, learning his routines and identifying his weaknesses. The kill itself was brutal and methodical. Konrad did not simply eliminate Varkesh, but made his death into a statement, leaving the gang leader's mutilated corpse in a location where it would be discovered by his followers. The body was arranged in a specific manner that conveyed a message about the consequences of preying upon the innocent, and Konrad ensured that the scene was discovered in a way that would maximize its psychological impact on those who found it. This was not merely murder, but theater, designed to instill fear in those who would continue Varkesh's work. The effect was immediate and profound. Word of Varkesh's death spread through the Underhive's criminal networks like wildfire, carried by terrified gang members who spoke in hushed tones of the pale figure who had somehow penetrated their leader's supposedly impregnable stronghold. The manner of the killing, combined with the symbolic arrangement of the corpse, created a legend that grew with each telling. The criminals of the Underhive began to speak of a ghost, a supernatural entity that could strike without warning and leave behind only mutilated remains as evidence of its presence. Konrad embraced this growing legend, recognizing the power of fear as a tool for controlling criminal behavior. He began to cultivate a specific persona, one that would become known throughout Nostramo as the Night Haunter. This identity was carefully constructed to maximize psychological impact, drawing upon the deepest fears and superstitions of the Underhive's population. The Night Haunter was not merely a killer, but a force of supernatural retribution, an entity that could see into the darkest corners of the human soul and punish those who believed themselves beyond justice. The development of the Night Haunter persona was as much psychological as it was tactical. Konrad used his visions to identify future crimes and their perpetrators, then struck with precise timing to prevent the worst atrocities from occurring. His methods were deliberately brutal, designed not just to eliminate specific threats, but to create a climate of fear that would deter others from following similar paths. Each killing was staged as a work of dark art, with the victim's body arranged to convey specific messages about the nature of their crimes and the consequences of evil actions. The Night Haunter's reputation grew through a campaign of carefully orchestrated terror that lasted several years. Konrad would appear without warning in the territories of the most violent gangs, eliminating their leaders and leaving behind scenes of carnage that defied explanation. His victims were always chosen based on the visions he received, targeting those who would commit the most heinous crimes in the future. The precision of his strikes and the apparent impossibility of his knowledge created an aura of supernatural dread that began to affect criminal behavior throughout the Underhive. Gang members started to abandon their most violent practices, not out of moral awakening, but from pure terror of attracting the Night Haunter's attention. The flesh trade that had flourished in the Underhive's darkest corners began to wither as its practitioners fled to other hive cities or abandoned their criminal activities entirely. Protection rackets collapsed as their operators became too frightened to venture into the territories where the Night Haunter was known to operate. The constant warfare between rival gangs diminished as their leaders became more concerned with avoiding the Pale Spectre than with expanding their territories. The psychological toll of this campaign on Konrad himself was immense. Each vision he experienced was a fresh trauma, forcing him to witness atrocities in vivid detail and then live with the knowledge that these events were inevitable unless he acted to prevent them. The weight of this responsibility, combined with his complete isolation from normal human contact, created a psychological burden that would have broken a lesser mind. Konrad's enhanced Primarch physiology allowed him to endure these stresses, but they left permanent marks on his psyche that would influence his behavior for the rest of his existence. The visions also began to show him glimpses of his own future, fragments of scenes that depicted him as both savior and destroyer, hero and monster. These self-referential prophecies were particularly disturbing because they suggested that his own actions would eventually lead to consequences as terrible as the crimes he sought to prevent. The knowledge that he was destined to become a figure of terror and violence, rather than the force for justice he believed himself to be, created a psychological paradox that would torment him throughout his life. As the Night Haunter's influence spread beyond the Underhive to the middle levels of Nostramo Quintus, Konrad began to encounter more sophisticated forms of corruption. The criminal organizations that operated in the Hive City's commercial and administrative sectors were more subtle in their methods, but no less destructive in their impact on the population. These groups used political influence, economic manipulation, and carefully applied violence to maintain their power, creating systems of oppression that were more complex than the simple brutality of the Underhive gangs. Nostramo's perpetual darkness was not merely an atmospheric condition, but a fundamental characteristic that permeated every aspect of life on the dying world. The planet's sun, a fading red dwarf star designated Nostramo Prime, cast barely enough light to distinguish day from night, leaving the surface in a constant state of twilight that ranged from deep gray to absolute black. This eternal gloom was compounded by the industrial pollution that had accumulated over millennia of intensive mining operations, creating a toxic atmosphere that filtered out what little stellar radiation managed to reach the planet's surface. The hive cities that dominated Nostramo's landscape were monuments to humanity's capacity for both industrial achievement and environmental destruction. These massive structures, built upon the skeletal remains of exhausted mining complexes, rose from the planet's scarred surface like metallic mountains, their foundations extending deep into the planet's crust, where generations of workers had extracted adamantium, promethium, and other strategic materials essential to the Imperium's war machine. The largest of these hive cities, Nostramo Quintus, housed over 200 million souls within its towering spires and subterranean warrens, creating a vertical ecosystem of human misery and exploitation. The planet's strategic importance to the Great Crusade could not be overstated. Nostramo's adamantium deposits, while largely depleted by the 31st millennium, still produced enough of the precious metal to supply several forge worlds with the raw materials needed for power armor, vehicle plating, and ship hulls. The mining operations that continued in the planet's deeper levels employed hundreds of thousands of workers who labored in conditions that would have been considered intolerable on more civilized worlds. These miners, known locally as tunnel rats, spent their entire lives in the planet's depths, their bodies adapted to the crushing darkness and toxic atmosphere through generations of exposure. The social hierarchy of Nostramo was as rigid as it was corrupt, with clear distinctions between the various levels of society that corresponded directly to their physical elevation within the hive cities. At the apex of this system were the noble houses, ancient families who had consolidated their power through centuries of political maneuvering, economic manipulation, and strategic violence. These aristocrats lived in the uppermost spires of the hive cities, where imported atmospheric processors provided breathable air and artificial lighting systems simulated the natural illumination that the planet's dying sun could no longer provide. The noble houses of Nostramo had long since abandoned any pretense of benevolent governance, instead operating as criminal organizations that used their hereditary positions to extract wealth from the population through taxation, forced labor, and protection rackets. House Krieg controlled the majority of the planet's remaining adamantium extraction operations, while House Vander maintained a stranglehold on the food distribution networks that kept the hive cities' populations from starving. House Mortius operated the planet's orbital defense platforms and used their military assets to enforce the will of the other noble families, creating a triumvirate of power that had ruled Nostramo for over 1,000 years. These noble houses maintained their positions through a combination of technological superiority and systematic brutality. Their private armies were equipped with advanced weapons and armor imported from forge worlds throughout the galaxy, giving them overwhelming advantages over any potential resistance from the lower levels of society. The nobles themselves were often augmented with life extension treatments and cybernetic enhancements that allowed them to maintain their power for centuries, creating dynasties that spanned multiple generations of normal human lifespans. The middle levels of Nostromo's hive cities were occupied by the merchant class, factory overseers, and skilled technicians who kept the planet's industrial infrastructure functioning. These individuals existed in a precarious position between the crushing oppression of the nobility above and the desperate violence of the underhive below. Many of them had achieved their positions through collaboration with the criminal organizations that controlled various aspects of the planet's economy, serving as intermediaries between the noble houses and the more violent elements of Nostromo's underworld. The merchant guilds that operated in the Hive City's commercial sectors were little more than legitimized criminal enterprises, using their control over trade routes and manufacturing facilities to extract tribute from smaller businesses and independent operators. The Guild of Scavengers controlled the salvage operations that stripped useful materials from the planet's abandoned mining sites, while the Flesh Merchants Consortium managed the slave trade that provided labor for the most dangerous industrial operations. These organizations operated with the tacit approval of the noble houses, who received a percentage of their profits in exchange for protection from law enforcement. The industrial sectors of the hive cities were dominated by massive manufactorums that produced weapons, ammunition, and other military supplies for the Imperial war effort. These facilities operated around the clock, their production lines staffed by workers who labored in conditions that bordered on slavery. The manufactorum overseers, drawn from the planet's middle class, maintained productivity through a combination of quotas, punishment details, and summary executions for those who failed to meet their assigned targets. The weapons produced in these facilities were of decent quality, but were often tainted by the corrupt practices of their manufacturers, who would substitute inferior materials or skip quality control procedures to increase their profit margins. The lower levels of the hive cities housed the bulk of Nostromo's population, millions of workers and their families who lived in cramped hab blocks built into the structural supports of the massive urban complexes. These areas were characterized by constant overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and the ever-present threat of structural collapse as the ancient foundations of the hive cities continued to deteriorate. The residents of these levels worked in the planet's remaining mines, manufactorums, and recycling facilities, earning barely enough to survive while supporting the lavish lifestyles of the classes above them. The underhive represented the absolute bottom of Nostromo's social hierarchy, a realm of perpetual darkness where the most desperate and violent elements of the population struggled for survival. These areas had been abandoned by the planetary government centuries earlier, left to govern themselves through a brutal system of gang warfare and territorial control. The underhive's population consisted of escaped slaves, failed criminals, mutants, and the descendants of workers who had been displaced by the closure of exhausted mining operations. These individuals lived in makeshift settlements built into the ruins of abandoned industrial facilities, surviving on scavenged materials and whatever they could steal from the levels above. The criminal organizations that controlled the underhive operated according to a simple philosophy: the strong preyed upon the weak, and survival depended on one's willingness to inflict violence upon others. The largest of these organizations, the Crimson Fang, controlled approximately 30% of the underhive's territory through a network of enforcers who collected tribute from smaller gangs and independent operators. The bone merchants specialized in the disposal of corpses and the harvesting of organs for sale to the planet's medical facilities, while the Shadow Cartel managed the distribution of illegal drugs and prohibited technologies throughout the hive cities. The culture of fear that permeated Nostromo society was not merely a byproduct of the planet's criminal organizations, but a deliberate tool used by the ruling classes to maintain their power. The noble houses encouraged violence and lawlessness in the lower levels of society, recognizing that a population consumed by internal conflict would be less likely to organize resistance against their oppressors. This policy of controlled chaos created a feedback loop where violence bred more violence, and the only way to achieve security was through the application of even greater brutality. The planet's judicial system, such as it was, operated according to principles that would have been considered barbaric on most imperial worlds. Justice was administered through a network of arbitrator stations that were staffed by corrupt officials who sold their verdicts to the highest bidder. The most common form of punishment was public execution, carried out in the Hive City's main thoroughfares as a form of entertainment for the population. These executions were often elaborate affairs that involved torture, mutilation, and other forms of ritualized violence designed to reinforce the power of the ruling classes. The ecclesiarchy maintained a minimal presence on Nostramo, operating a handful of temples in the upper levels of the Hive cities, where the noble houses could display their supposed piety. These religious institutions were thoroughly corrupted by the planet's criminal culture, with many of their priests serving as money launderers and information brokers for the various criminal organizations. The imperial cult as practiced on Nostramo emphasized the emperor's role as a figure of judgment and retribution rather than protection and guidance, creating a theological framework that justified the planet's culture of violence and exploitation. The planet's educational system was designed to perpetuate the existing social order by ensuring that the lower classes remained ignorant and compliant. The children of the noble houses received comprehensive educations that prepared them for leadership roles in the planet's criminal enterprises, while the offspring of the working classes were taught only the basic skills necessary for their assigned roles in the industrial economy. Those born in the Underhive received no formal education at all, learning survival skills through direct experience of the planet's violent culture. The recruitment practices of Nostramo's criminal organizations reflected the planet's broader social dynamics. New members were typically drawn from the most violent and ruthless elements of the population, individuals who had demonstrated their willingness to commit atrocities in service of their own survival. These recruits were subjected to initiation rituals that involved increasingly severe acts of violence, designed to break down their moral inhibitions and create absolute loyalty to their criminal families. The most successful of these recruits would eventually rise through the ranks to become gang leaders and crime bosses, perpetuating the cycle of violence and exploitation that defined Nostramo society. The planet's law enforcement agencies were thoroughly infiltrated by criminal elements, with many arbites and local security forces serving as paid informants or active participants in the various illegal enterprises that dominated the planet's economy. The few honest officers who attempted to combat corruption were quickly eliminated through assassination or framing operations, creating a climate where criminal activity could flourish with minimal interference from official authorities. This systematic corruption extended to the planet's military forces, whose officers often used their positions to facilitate smuggling operations and other illegal activities. The environmental degradation that had resulted from centuries of industrial exploitation created additional challenges for Nostramo's population. The planet's water supplies were contaminated with heavy metals and industrial chemicals, leading to widespread health problems and genetic mutations among the working classes. The air quality in the lower levels of the Hive cities was so poor that many residents developed respiratory diseases that shortened their lifespans significantly. These environmental factors contributed to the planet's culture of desperation and violence, as individuals struggled to survive in conditions that were barely compatible with human life. The technological infrastructure of Nostramo reflected the planet's corrupt and violent culture. The Hive City's power systems were frequently sabotaged by rival criminal organizations, leading to regular blackouts that plunged entire sectors into darkness. The transportation networks were controlled by various gangs who charged tribute for safe passage through their territories, making movement between different areas of the Hive cities dangerous and expensive. The communication systems were monitored by multiple intelligence networks, creating a climate of paranoia where private conversations could be used as weapons against political rivals. This was the world that had shaped Konrad Curze's understanding of humanity and justice, a planet where corruption and violence were not aberrations, but fundamental aspects of daily existence. The Night Haunter's methods, brutal as they were, represented a logical response to the systemic failures of Nostramo's society. In a world where traditional forms of law enforcement had been completely corrupted, terror became the only effective tool for maintaining order. The fear that Curze inspired in the planet's criminal classes was not merely a byproduct of his activities, but a deliberate strategy for creating behavioral change through psychological manipulation. The Emperor's arrival on Nostramo came without fanfare or grand proclamation, as befitted a world that had learned to fear sudden changes in the established order. His vessel, a massive battleship of the Imperial Navy designated as the Bucephalus, emerged from the warp at the edge of the Nostramo system on a trajectory that suggested careful reconnaissance rather than immediate conquest. The ship's sensors had detected the psychic emanations that marked the presence of one of the lost Primarchs, but the Emperor's approach was cautious, informed by the experiences of reuniting with his other sons and the understanding that each world had shaped its Primarch in unique and sometimes troubling ways. The planet's orbital defense platforms, controlled by House Mortius, tracked the approaching Imperial vessel with weapons systems that had been upgraded with technology acquired through black market dealings with rogue tech adepts. The noble houses had maintained their independence through a combination of bribery, political maneuvering, and the strategic application of violence against Imperial tax collectors and compliance officers. Their response to the Emperor's arrival was characteristically duplicitous, with public transmissions expressing loyalty to the Imperium, while private communications coordinated defensive strategies and evacuation plans for the most valuable members of the planetary elite. The Emperor's psychic presence was felt throughout Nostramo's hive cities as his ship entered orbit, a sensation that manifested differently across the planet's various social strata. The noble houses experienced it as a pressure in their augmented minds, a weight that pressed against their consciousness and made their cybernetic implants spark with electrical discharge. The working classes felt it as a stirring in their souls, a momentary respite from the crushing despair that defined their daily existence. In the Underhive, the sensation was more violent, causing psychically sensitive individuals to collapse in convulsions, while others experienced vivid hallucinations of golden light piercing the eternal darkness. Konrad Curze felt the Emperor's approach as a disruption in the flow of his prophetic visions, a presence that seemed to bend the currents of fate around itself like a massive gravitational field. The Night Haunter had been stalking a particularly vicious gang leader through the abandoned industrial sectors of Nostramo Quintus, when the psychic shockwave of the Emperor's arrival struck him with the force of a physical blow. His visions, normally crystal clear in their depiction of future atrocities, became fragmented and contradictory, showing him glimpses of golden armor, burning cities, and his own death in a dozen different scenarios. The Emperor's first action upon reaching Nostramo was not to announce his presence to the planetary government, but to descend directly to the surface of Nostramo Quintus, accompanied by a small retinue of custodian guards and a single company of Imperial fists. His destination was not the noble spires where the planet's rulers maintained their palaces, but the deeper levels of the Hive City, where his psychic senses had detected the presence of his lost son. The Emperor's ability to perceive the unique psychic signature of each Primarch allowed him to track Konrad's location with precision, following the trail of terror and violence that marked the Night Haunter's passage through the Underhive. The meeting between the Emperor and Konrad Curze took place in the ruins of an abandoned manufactorum, a vast space filled with the skeletal remains of production machinery and the detritus of centuries of industrial decay. The Emperor found his son crouched over the mutilated corpse of a gang enforcer, the body arranged in a specific pattern that conveyed information about the victim's crimes to those who would discover it. Konrad's pale skin was streaked with blood, his black eyes reflecting the dim light of the Emperor's psychic aura as he looked up at the figure who had found him in the depths of Nostramo's darkness. The Emperor's first words to his eighth son were not of greeting or recognition, but of understanding, acknowledging the burden of prophetic sight that had shaped Konrad's existence and the methods he had developed to cope with the visions of humanity's darkest impulses. The Master of Mankind had experienced his own prophetic visions throughout the millennia, seeing the branching paths of possible futures and the terrible choices that would be required to guide humanity toward survival. He recognized in Konrad a kindred spirit, another being cursed with the knowledge of what was to come and the responsibility to act upon that knowledge. Konrad's initial response to the Emperor's presence was one of suspicion and barely contained hostility. The Night Haunter had learned to trust no one, his visions having shown him the betrayals and corruptions that lurked in the hearts of those who claimed to serve justice. He questioned the Emperor's motives, demanding to know why he had come to Nostramo and what he wanted from the planet's population. The Primarch's voice carried the weight of years spent in isolation, speaking in the harsh dialect of the Underhive and punctuating his words with references to the crimes he had witnessed and the punishments he had administered. The Emperor's explanation of the Great Crusade and humanity's destiny among the stars was met with skepticism from Konrad, who had seen enough of human nature to doubt the possibility of lasting unity or peace. The Night Haunter's visions had shown him glimpses of the future that awaited the Imperium, scenes of civil war, betrayal, and the collapse of the dream of human enlightenment. He challenged the Emperor's vision of a unified galaxy, arguing that humanity's capacity for corruption and violence made such unity impossible without the constant application of fear and brutal punishment. The philosophical tensions between the Emperor and Konrad became apparent during their extended conversation in the abandoned Manufactorum. The Emperor spoke of bringing worlds into compliance through negotiation, cultural exchange, and the promise of technological advancement and protection from alien threats. Konrad countered with examples from his own experience on Nostramo, describing how the planet's criminals had only responded to terror and violence, how fear had been the only effective tool for creating behavioral change in a population that had been thoroughly corrupted by centuries of exploitation and abuse. The Emperor's response to these arguments revealed the pragmatic aspects of his character that were often hidden beneath the facade of benevolent leadership. He acknowledged that some worlds would require harsher methods of compliance, that the Great Crusade would necessarily involve violence and coercion, in addition to diplomacy and persuasion. The Master of Mankind had not conquered 2/3 of the galaxy through gentle words alone, and he recognized that Konrad's methods, while extreme, had achieved results that more conventional approaches might not have accomplished. The integration of Konrad Curze into the imperial hierarchy required careful consideration of his unique skills and psychological profile. The Emperor could not simply transplant the Night Haunter into the role of a traditional Primarch, leading armies in open warfare and governing compliant worlds. Instead, he envisioned a more specialized role for his eighth son, one that would utilize Konrad's talents for psychological warfare and his understanding of criminal behavior to serve the broader goals of the Great Crusade. The transformation of the 8th Legion from the Revenant Legion to the Night Lords began with the integration of Nostramo recruits into the existing Terran-born Astartes. The process was complicated by the cultural differences between the two groups, with the Terran Marines having been raised according to the disciplined traditions of the Imperial military, while the Nostraman recruits brought with them the brutal pragmatism of their homeworld's criminal culture. The gene seed implantation process proceeded normally, but the psychological conditioning required significant modifications to account for the unique characteristics of the Nostraman candidates. The Nostraman recruits were drawn primarily from the survivors of the Night Haunter's campaign of terror, individuals who had either served as his informants or had demonstrated the psychological resilience necessary to function in the planet's violent environment. These candidates possessed an intimate understanding of fear as a tool of control and had already been conditioned to accept extreme violence as a necessary component of justice. Their integration into the 8th Legion brought with them tactical doctrines that emphasized psychological warfare, terror tactics, and the systematic use of brutality to achieve strategic objectives. The cultural transformation of the 8th Legion was gradual but profound, with the Nostramo recruits gradually influencing the behavior and attitudes of their Terran-born battle brothers. The Legion's combat doctrine evolved to incorporate the terror tactics that had proven so effective on Nostramo, with squads specializing in night fighting, psychological operations, and the systematic demoralization of enemy forces. The Legion's iconography changed to reflect this new identity, with the traditional symbols of the Revenant Legion being replaced by images of skulls, bats, and other symbols associated with death and fear. The Night Lord's approach to compliance operations differed significantly from that of other Space Marine legions, focusing on the identification and elimination of criminal elements rather than the conquest of military targets. Their operations typically began with extensive intelligence gathering, using their understanding of criminal psychology to identify the key figures in a world's underworld and the methods by which they maintained their power. The Night Lords would then systematically eliminate these individuals, often in public and spectacular fashion, creating a climate of fear that would cause other criminal organizations to surrender or flee. The effectiveness of these methods was demonstrated during the compliance of Cherau, a hive world whose population had been terrorized by a network of criminal cartels that controlled the planet's food distribution and manufacturing sectors. The Night Lord's approach to the problem was characteristically direct, with squads of Astartes infiltrating the planet's underworld and systematically eliminating cartel leadership through a series of carefully orchestrated assassinations. The psychological impact of these operations was amplified by the Night Lord's practice of leaving the bodies of their victims in locations where they would be discovered by other criminals, creating a demonstration effect that caused entire criminal organizations to collapse without further military action. The integration of Nostramo tactical doctrines into the Night Lord's operational procedures created a legion that was uniquely suited to operations against criminal organizations, corrupt governments, and other non-traditional military targets. Their specialization in psychological warfare made them particularly effective against enemies who relied on fear and intimidation to maintain their power, as the Night Lords could turn these same weapons against their opponents with devastating effect. The Legion's reputation for brutality and their willingness to employ extreme methods made them valuable assets for compliance operations that required the complete elimination of existing power structures. The Emperor's recognition of Konrad Curze as the 8th Primarch was formalized through a series of ceremonies that took place both on Nostramo and aboard the flagship of the 8th Legion. These rituals served multiple purposes, establishing Konrad's authority over his legion, while also demonstrating the Emperor's acceptance of the Night Haunter's methods as legitimate tools of imperial policy. The ceremonies were attended by representatives from other legions, providing an opportunity for Konrad to meet his brother Primarchs and begin the process of integration into the broader command structure of the Great Crusade. The reactions of the other Primarchs to their newly discovered brother were mixed, with some expressing concern about the Night Lord's methods, while others recognized the practical value of having a legion specialized in psychological warfare and counter-insurgency operations. Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists appreciated the tactical applications of fear as a weapon, while Robute Gilliman of the Ultramarines questioned whether the Night Lord's approach was consistent with the Imperium's stated goals of bringing enlightenment and civilization to the galaxy. These philosophical differences would continue to create tension between Konrad and his brothers throughout the Great Crusade, contributing to his growing sense of isolation and alienation from the Imperial project. The Emperor's decision to allow Konrad to maintain his brutal methods while serving as a Primarch reflected the pragmatic realities of the Great Crusade and the recognition that different worlds would require different approaches to achieve compliance. The Night Lord's specialization in terror tactics and psychological warfare filled a crucial gap in the Imperium's military capabilities, providing a tool for dealing with criminal organizations, corrupt governments, and other non-traditional threats that conventional military forces might struggle to address effectively. The Emperor's acceptance of these methods, despite their obvious moral implications, demonstrated his willingness to compromise his ideals in service of the greater goal of human unity and survival. The organizational structure of the Night Lord's Legion reflected the brutal pragmatism that had characterized Konrad Curze's reign of terror on Nostramo, adapted for the larger scale of galactic warfare. Unlike the rigid hierarchies employed by legions such as the Ultramarines or the disciplined company structures of the Imperial Fists, the Night Lords operated according to a more fluid system that emphasized individual initiative and the exploitation of fear as a tactical weapon. The Legion was divided into companies that ranged in size from 800 to 1,200 Astartes, with each company further subdivided into terror squads, assault claws, and raptor packs that could operate independently or in coordination depending on the tactical situation. The command structure of the Night Lords was built around the concept of proven lethality rather than traditional military rank. Squad leaders, known as claw leaders, earned their positions through demonstrated skill in psychological warfare and the ability to inspire fear in both enemies and subordinates. Company captains, designated as Terror Lords, were selected based on their success in compliance operations and their understanding of the criminal psychology that the Legion had inherited from its Nostraman recruits. This meritocratic approach to leadership created a competitive environment within the Legion, where advancement required not just tactical competence, but also the willingness to employ increasingly extreme methods to achieve objectives. The recruitment practices of the Night Lord's Legion represented a fundamental departure from the selection criteria employed by other Space Marine legions. While most legions sought candidates who displayed courage, honor, and loyalty to the Imperial cause, the Night Lords actively recruited from Nostramo's criminal population, targeting individuals who had demonstrated the psychological resilience necessary to function in the planet's violent underworld. These recruits were typically drawn from the survivors of gang warfare, the children of executed criminals, and those who had served as informants for the Night Haunter's campaign of terror against the planet's criminal organizations. The selection process for Night Lords recruits involved psychological evaluations that would have disqualified candidates from other legions. Potential Astartes were tested for their ability to inflict pain without emotional distress, their capacity to manipulate others through fear and intimidation, and their willingness to abandon conventional moral constraints in pursuit of tactical objectives. The Legion's apothecaries, many of whom had been recruited from Nostramo's body merchants and organ harvesters, developed specialized screening procedures that identified candidates with the specific psychological profile required for the Night Lord's unique operational methods. The gene seed implantation process for Night Lords recruits proceeded along the same biological pathways as other legions, but the psychological conditioning that accompanied the transformation was tailored to enhance the candidates' capacity for violence and their resistance to the moral qualms that might interfere with their assigned duties. The hypno-indoctrination procedures used by the Legion emphasized the necessity of fear as a tool of control and the righteousness of extreme violence when employed against the enemies of humanity. These conditioning protocols created Astartes who were capable of committing atrocities without experiencing the psychological trauma that would affect normal humans, while simultaneously maintaining the tactical discipline necessary for effective military operations. The integration of Nostraman cultural elements into the Night Lord's organizational structure created a legion that operated according to principles borrowed from the planet's criminal organizations. The concept of territorial control, fundamental to gang warfare on Nostramo, was adapted for use in compliance operations, with Night Lords companies claiming responsibility for specific sectors of target worlds and competing with each other for the most spectacular victories. The practice of taking trophies from defeated enemies, common among Nostramo's criminal gangs, became institutionalized within the Legion as a method of demonstrating individual prowess and maintaining morale. The tactical doctrines employed by the Night Lord's Legion were designed to maximize the psychological impact of their operations while minimizing the resources required to achieve compliance. The Legion's approach to warfare emphasized the identification and elimination of key enemy leaders, the systematic destruction of morale through terror tactics, and the creation of conditions that would cause opposing forces to surrender or flee rather than fight to the death. These methods were particularly effective against human opponents who relied on conventional military hierarchies and could be demoralized through the spectacular elimination of their command structures. The Night Lord's signature warfare methods centered on the systematic application of fear as a strategic weapon. Their operations typically began with extensive intelligence gathering, using infiltration specialists and local informants to identify the power structures and psychological vulnerabilities of target populations. The Legion's terror squads would then conduct a series of carefully orchestrated strikes designed to eliminate key figures while maximizing the psychological impact on the remaining population. These operations were characterized by their precision, their brutality, and their theatrical nature, with each attack designed to send specific messages about the consequences of resistance to imperial authority. The use of psychological warfare by the Night Lords extended beyond simple intimidation to encompass sophisticated manipulation of enemy morale and decision-making processes. The Legion's specialists in terror tactics understood that fear was most effective when it was unpredictable, and when its victims could not identify clear patterns that might allow them to adapt or prepare countermeasures. Night Lord's operations therefore incorporated elements of randomness and apparent irrationality, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that prevented enemy forces from developing effective responses to their tactics. The development of specialized equipment and weapon systems reflected the Night Lord's focus on psychological warfare and terror tactics. The Legion's artificers, many of whom had been recruited from Nostramo's weaponsmiths and torture device manufacturers, created modified bolt rounds designed to produce maximum psychological impact rather than simple lethality. These ammunition types included explosive rounds that created spectacular visual effects, sonic charges that produced terrifying sounds when detonated, and chemical payloads that released pheromones designed to trigger panic responses in human nervous systems. The Night Lord's approach to close combat emphasized the creation of fear through the systematic mutilation of enemy combatants. Their combat doctrines included specific techniques for inflicting non-fatal wounds that would cause maximum psychological trauma to surviving enemies, methods for arranging corpses to create specific psychological effects, and procedures for conducting executions that would serve as examples to other potential opponents. These techniques were codified in training manuals that were distributed throughout the Legion, ensuring that all Night Lords possessed the skills necessary to conduct effective psychological warfare operations. The Legion's iconography and visual identity were carefully designed to enhance the psychological impact of their presence on the battlefield. The Night Lords adopted a color scheme of midnight blue and bronze that made their armor difficult to distinguish in low-light conditions, while creating an ominous appearance that was immediately recognizable to those who had encountered the Legion before. Their helmet designs incorporated elements borrowed from the predatory creatures of Nostramo's ecosystem, including stylized bat wings and elongated craniums that created a distinctly inhuman appearance. The significance of flayed skin as trophies within the Night Lord's Legion represented both a practical tool for psychological warfare and a cultural practice inherited from Nostramo's criminal organizations. The taking of skin from defeated enemies served multiple purposes within the Legion's operational procedures, providing both a method of demonstrating individual prowess and a means of creating terror among enemy populations. The practice was formalized through specific rituals that determined which enemies were worthy of such treatment and established procedures for the proper preparation and display of these trophies. The flaying process itself was conducted according to techniques that had been refined over centuries of practice by Nostramo's criminal gangs, adapted for use by Astartes with enhanced strength and precision. Night Lord specialists in this practice, known as flensers, possessed detailed knowledge of human anatomy that allowed them to remove skin in specific patterns that would maximize the psychological impact on those who discovered the remains. The flayed skin was then treated with chemical preservatives and prepared for display according to established protocols that ensured the trophies would remain intact for extended periods. The display of flayed skin served both ceremonial and tactical purposes within the Night Lord's Legion. Individual Astartes would wear strips of skin from particularly notable enemies as decorations on their armor, creating a visual record of their combat achievements that could be recognized by other members of the Legion. Larger pieces of skin were used to create banners and standards that were displayed during combat operations, serving as psychological weapons that could demoralize enemy forces and demonstrate the fate that awaited those who resisted Imperial authority. The ritualistic aspects of flaying within the Night Lord's Legion created a complex system of meaning that extended beyond simple trophy taking. The location from which skin was removed, the method of preparation, and the manner of display all conveyed specific information about the circumstances of the enemy's defeat and the nature of their crimes against the Imperium. This symbolic language was understood by all members of the Legion and served as a form of internal communication that reinforced the Legion's cultural identity and operational doctrines. The Night Lord's approach to compliance operations during the Great Crusade demonstrated the effectiveness of their terror tactics against a wide variety of enemy forces. Their methods proved particularly successful against human populations that had been isolated from the Imperium for extended periods and had developed their own political and military structures. The Legion's ability to identify and eliminate key figures in these societies, combined with their skill at creating psychological conditions that prevented effective resistance, allowed them to achieve compliance with minimal expenditure of resources and Imperial lives. The compliance of Karaten demonstrated the Night Lord's effectiveness against a world that had been controlled by a network of criminal cartels similar to those that had once dominated Nostramo. The planet's population of 40 million was spread across a dozen hive cities, each controlled by a different criminal organization that maintained power through the systematic application of violence and intimidation. The Night Lord's approach to the problem involved the systematic elimination of cartel leadership through a series of coordinated terror strikes that created a cascade of fear throughout the criminal hierarchy. The operation began with the infiltration of Karaten's underworld by Night Lord specialists who had been trained in the methods of criminal organizations. These operatives spent several months gathering intelligence on the power structures and operational procedures of the various cartels, identifying key figures and mapping the relationships between different criminal groups. The information gathered during this phase allowed the Night Lords to develop a comprehensive understanding of their enemies' psychological vulnerabilities and tactical weaknesses. The elimination phase of the operation was conducted over a period of 6 weeks, with Night Lords' terror squads systematically targeting cartel leaders and their immediate subordinates. Each killing was designed to send specific messages to the remaining criminal organizations, with the methods of execution and the display of corpses carefully chosen to maximize psychological impact. The Night Lord's use of flayed skin as trophies proved particularly effective against enemies who had employed similar practices in their own operations, creating a demonstration effect that caused entire criminal hierarchies to collapse without further military action. The compliance of Tsaguelsa showcased the Night Lord's ability to deal with Xeno's threats that relied on psychological warfare as their primary tactical doctrine. The world was inhabited by a species of psychically active predators that had developed sophisticated methods of manipulating the fears and anxieties of their prey. These creatures, known locally as the Umbral Stalkers, had successfully resisted previous Imperial compliance efforts by turning the psychological conditioning of Space Marines against them, creating hallucinations and phobias that rendered conventional military tactics ineffective. The Night Lord's approach to the Umbral Stalkers was based on their understanding that fear was most effective when it was unexpected, and when its victims possessed emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The Legion's psychological conditioning, designed to eliminate moral qualms and emotional attachments, provided them with a degree of resistance to the Xenos' mental attacks that other Imperial forces had lacked. The Night Lords were able to engage the Umbral Stalkers in direct combat, while simultaneously employing their own terror tactics to disrupt the creatures' hunting patterns and social structures. The campaign on Sagualsa lasted for 8 months and involved the systematic elimination of the Umbral Stalkers' breeding populations and the destruction of their underground lairs. The Night Lords' use of sonic weapons and chemical agents proved particularly effective against enemies that relied on stealth and surprise, forcing the creatures to abandon their preferred tactics and engage in direct confrontation, where the superior equipment and training of the Astartes gave them decisive advantages. The final phase of the operation involved the complete extermination of the Xenos population, with Night Lord specialists ensuring that no breeding pairs survived to re-establish the species. The compliance of Olympia, while primarily conducted by the Iron Warriors Legion, involved significant Night Lords' participation in the suppression of the planet's criminal underground. The world's population had developed a sophisticated system of organized crime that operated in parallel with the official government, creating a shadow economy that controlled significant portions of the planet's industrial output. The Night Lords' expertise in dealing with criminal organizations made them valuable allies for the Iron Warriors, who were more suited to conventional military operations than the specialized tactics required for counter-insurgency warfare. The Night Lords' contribution to the Olympia compliance involved the identification and elimination of key figures in the planet's criminal hierarchy, using methods that had been refined during their operations on Nostramo and other worlds. Their success in dismantling the criminal networks that had supported resistance to Imperial authority demonstrated the value of their specialized skills and established their reputation as the Imperium's premier specialists in psychological warfare and terror tactics. The operation also provided opportunities for the Night Lords to refine their techniques and develop new methods for dealing with increasingly sophisticated criminal organizations. The prophetic abilities that had manifested during Konrad Curze's childhood on Nostramo intensified exponentially following his reunion with the Emperor and his assumption of command over the 8th Legion, where once his visions had been limited to the immediate future of his homeworld's criminal underworld. The psychic awakening triggered by proximity to the Master of Mankind expanded his perception to encompass the vast tapestry of galactic events that would unfold over the coming millennia. These enhanced visions struck him with increasing frequency and intensity, each one a vivid sensory experience that transported his consciousness across space and time to witness events that had not yet occurred, but were as inevitable as the decay of Nostromo's dying sun. The first major prophetic episode that Curze experienced after taking command of the Night Lords occurred during the compliance of Cherout, when his consciousness was suddenly overwhelmed by images of his brother Primarchs locked in mortal combat across the burning ruins of Terra. He witnessed Horus, the favored son whom he had met only briefly during the triumph of Ulanor, standing triumphant over the broken body of Sanguinius, while the Emperor lay dying beneath the weight of unimaginable psychic trauma. The vision was so vivid that Curze could smell the acrid smoke of burning adamantium and feel the psychic screams of dying space marines echoing across the Imperial palace's shattered walls. The specificity of these prophetic visions distinguished them from the abstract premonitions experienced by other psychers throughout the galaxy. Curze did not merely sense the general direction of future events, but witnessed them with the clarity of direct observation, seeing the faces of individual combatants, hearing their final words, and experiencing their deaths as if he were present on the battlefield. During one particularly intense vision, he observed his brother Ferrus Manus being decapitated by Fulgrim's blade, watching in horrifying detail as the Iron Hands Primarch's head rolled across the black sand of Istvan V, while his Gene sons screamed in anguish at the sight of their father's destruction. The psychological impact of witnessing these future atrocities was compounded by Curze's complete inability to alter the events he observed. His visions were not warnings that could be heeded or prophecies that could be prevented through careful action, but immutable records of events that would occur regardless of any intervention he might attempt. This knowledge created a profound sense of helplessness that ate away at his sanity like acid, forcing him to watch his brothers betray everything they had sworn to protect while being powerless to prevent the catastrophe he knew was approaching. The visions of the Horus Heresy revealed to Curze the fundamental hypocrisy that lay at the heart of the Imperial project. He witnessed the Emperor's secret negotiations with the Chaos gods on Malech, seeing the master of mankind's willingness to bargain with the very entities that represented everything the Great Crusade claimed to oppose. The knowledge that the Emperor had gained his power through deals with the ruinous powers, while simultaneously condemning others for similar associations, created a philosophical crisis that shattered Curze's already fragile faith in the righteousness of the Imperial cause. The prophetic visions also revealed to Curze the true nature of his own destiny, showing him scenes of his eventual death at the hands of the Calidus assassin Mushen on the world of Tsagualsa. He witnessed his final moments in excruciating detail, seeing the assassin's blade pierce his heart while he made no attempt to defend himself, accepting death as the inevitable conclusion to a life spent in service to a cause that had been corrupted from its very inception. The knowledge of his own mortality, combined with the certainty that his death would accomplish nothing meaningful, created a fatalistic worldview that influenced every decision he made as a Primarch. The burden of foresight extended beyond major galactic events to encompass the personal tragedies that would befall his own legion. Curze witnessed the gradual corruption of his Gene sons, seeing how their recruitment from Nostramo's criminal population would eventually lead to atrocities that would make even the Night Lord's sanctioned terror tactics seem restrained by comparison. He observed individual Astartes, whom he had personally trained and indoctrinated, committing acts of senseless violence against Imperial citizens, their psychological conditioning failing to contain the criminal impulses that had been bred into them through generations of exposure to Nostramo's toxic culture. The visions of his legion's future crimes created a paradox that tormented Curze throughout his service during the Great Crusade. He knew that the recruitment practices he had established were creating the very monsters that would eventually justify the Night Lord's condemnation by the Imperium. Yet he also understood that these same practices were necessary to maintain the Legion's effectiveness in its assigned role. The knowledge that his attempts to create a force capable of enforcing justice through fear would ultimately produce criminals worse than those they were meant to punish created a cycle of self-fulfilling prophecy that drove him deeper into madness. The prophetic abilities that had once allowed Curze to anticipate and prevent crimes on Nostramo became a source of constant torment when applied to the scale of galactic events. Where he had once been able to use his visions to save individual lives by eliminating specific threats, the scope of the coming catastrophe was too vast for any single individual to address. The knowledge that billions would die in the civil war that would tear the Imperium apart, combined with his inability to prevent these deaths, created a psychological burden that no mind, even one enhanced by Primarch physiology, could bear indefinitely. The relationship between Curze and his brother Primarchs was profoundly affected by his prophetic visions, particularly his knowledge of which among them would remain loyal to the Emperor, and which would fall to the temptations of chaos. His interactions with Horus became increasingly strained as he witnessed repeated visions of the War Master's corruption, seeing the slow transformation of the Emperor's favored son into a puppet of the Dark Gods. The knowledge that Horus would ultimately be responsible for the deaths of countless loyal Astartes created a tension that Curze struggled to conceal during their few meetings. The visions of Angron's transformation into a demon prince were particularly disturbing to Curze, as they showed him the ultimate fate that awaited Primarchs who allowed themselves to be consumed by their darker impulses. He witnessed the World Eater's Primarch's apotheosis in graphic detail, seeing Angron's physical form dissolve into a manifestation of pure rage and violence that bore no resemblance to the warrior he had once been. These visions served as a warning of what Curze himself might become if he allowed his own psychological instability to progress unchecked. The prophetic knowledge of Fulgrim's corruption by the Lair Blade created additional complications in Curze's relationship with the Emperor's children Primarch. The visions showed him the gradual process by which the demon weapon would consume Fulgrim's soul, transforming the perfectionist warrior into a creature of pure sensation and excess. The knowledge that one of his brothers would willingly surrender his humanity in pursuit of impossible perfection created a philosophical crisis that reinforced Curze's growing nihilism about the nature of existence. The Emperor's response to Curze's prophetic abilities was complex and evolved over time as the Master of Mankind came to understand the true scope of his son's visions. Initially, the Emperor viewed Curze's gift as a valuable intelligence asset that could provide strategic advantages during the Great Crusade. The ability to anticipate enemy movements and identify potential threats before they materialized was seen as a significant tactical advantage that could save Imperial lives and resources. However, as the content of Curze's visions became apparent, the Emperor's attitude shifted to one of concern and eventual resignation. The Emperor's own prophetic abilities allowed him to perceive the general outline of the coming catastrophe, but his visions lacked the specificity and clarity that characterized Curze's experiences. The Master of Mankind could see the broad strokes of the civil war that would tear the Imperium apart, but he could not identify the specific individuals who would betray their oaths or the exact circumstances that would lead to the conflict. Curze's detailed knowledge of these events created a unique situation where the son possessed information that the father desperately needed, but could not act upon without risking the very future he sought to prevent. The philosophical debates between the Emperor and Curze regarding the nature of predestination and free will become increasingly heated as the Great Crusade progressed. The Emperor maintained that the future was not fixed, that the choices made by individuals could alter the course of events and prevent the catastrophes that Curze had witnessed. Curze countered with the evidence of his visions, arguing that every attempt to change the future only served to ensure that the prophesied events would occur exactly as he had seen them. These debates reflected fundamental differences in their understanding of the nature of time and causality that could never be reconciled. The psychological toll of bearing witness to the inevitable destruction of everything he had helped to build created a progressive deterioration in Curze's mental state that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. His interactions with his own gene sons became more volatile and unpredictable, with the Primarch alternating between periods of withdrawn contemplation and explosive violence. The Night Lords who served under his direct command learned to recognize the signs that indicated when their Primarch was experiencing particularly intense visions, adjusting their behavior accordingly to avoid triggering violent outbursts. The growing nihilism that characterized Curze's worldview was reinforced by his prophetic knowledge of the Emperor's ultimate fate. The visions showed him the Master of Mankind's entombment within the Golden Throne, reduced to a psychic beacon that would guide humanity through the darkness, while being unable to actively participate in the governance of the Imperium. The knowledge that the Emperor's grand design would ultimately fail, leaving humanity trapped in a cycle of endless warfare and gradual decay, created a philosophical framework that justified increasingly extreme methods of achieving short-term objectives. The concept of justice that had originally motivated Curze's vigilante activities on Nostramo became increasingly distorted, as his prophetic visions revealed the futility of attempting to create lasting change through violence. Where he had once believed that fear could be used as a tool to modify behavior and create more just societies, the knowledge of the Imperium's eventual fate convinced him that such efforts were meaningless in the face of humanity's inherent capacity for corruption. This realization led to a gradual shift in his methodology, with justice becoming less important than the simple application of punishment for its own sake. The isolation that Curze experienced as a result of his prophetic burden was compounded by his inability to share the knowledge of future events with those around him. The visions were too specific and too terrible to be dismissed as mere possibilities, yet yet they were also too dangerous to be revealed to individuals who might attempt to prevent them. The knowledge that his brother Primarchs would eventually turn against each other created a situation where every interaction was colored by the awareness of future betrayals, making genuine friendship or trust impossible to maintain. The progressive deterioration of Curze's psychological state was accelerated by the increasing frequency and intensity of his prophetic visions as the time of the Horus Heresy approached. The visions began to occur with such regularity that they interfered with his ability to function normally, creating periods where he was completely unresponsive to external stimuli, while his consciousness was transported to witness future events. These episodes became a source of concern for the Night Lord's senior officers, who struggled to maintain operational effectiveness while their Primarch was increasingly incapacitated by his psychic burden. The knowledge of his own inevitable death created a fatalistic approach to personal safety that manifested in increasingly reckless behavior during combat operations. Curze began to take unnecessary risks during battles, exposing himself to enemy fire and engaging in close combat without regard for tactical considerations. This behavior was interpreted by his Gene Sons as evidence of their Primarch's supreme confidence in his abilities, but it actually reflected his growing indifference to his own survival in the face of the predetermined nature of his fate. The transformation of Konrad Curze from a vigilante seeking justice into a monster driven by compulsive cruelty was not a sudden metamorphosis, but a gradual erosion of sanity that occurred over decades of campaigning during the Great Crusade. The prophetic visions that had once served as tools for preventing crime on Nostramo became instruments of psychological torture, forcing him to witness the inevitable corruption of everything he had sought to protect. Each vision of the coming civil war, each glimpse of his brother's betrayals, and each preview of the Imperium's ultimate decay chipped away at the foundations of his rationality, until only the raw compulsion to inflict punishment remained. The first documented incident of excessive violence that drew criticism from other Imperial forces occurred during the compliance of Sheol, a mining world whose population had been enslaved by a consortium of off-world merchants. The Night Lord's initial approach to the liberation followed established protocols, with terror squads eliminating the merchant overlords and their security forces through coordinated strikes designed to minimize civilian casualties. However, when Curze discovered through his visions that several of the freed slaves would eventually become criminals themselves, he ordered the execution of 3,000 individuals who had committed no crimes beyond those he had witnessed in prophetic glimpses of possible futures. The massacre at Sheol's primary mining complex was conducted with methodical precision, with Night Lord squads herding the condemned into processing facilities where they were systematically executed and their bodies fed into the industrial furnaces. The Primarch's justification for these killings was that he was preventing future crimes, eliminating individuals who would inevitably cause suffering if allowed to live. The surviving population of Sheol was left traumatized not by their liberation from slavery, but by the arbitrary nature of the executions that followed, creating a compliance that was built on terror rather than gratitude. The Imperial Army units that had been assigned to provide garrison forces for Sheol reported the incident to their superiors, describing the Night Lord's actions as unnecessary and counterproductive to the goals of the Great Crusade. The reports detailed how the executions had been carried out without trial or evidence of wrongdoing, based solely on Curze's claims of prophetic knowledge. The documentation of these events reached the attention of other Primarchs, who began to express concerns about their brother's methods and mental state. Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists was among the first to formally protest the Night Lord's conduct, arguing that the systematic execution of innocent civilians violated the fundamental principles of imperial justice. His criticism was based not on moral objections to violence, but on practical concerns about the effectiveness of terror tactics that targeted populations indiscriminately. Dorn's position was that fear was most effective when it was applied precisely against those who deserved punishment, and that random executions would ultimately undermine imperial authority by creating resentment rather than compliance. The response from Robute Guilliman of the Ultramarines was more comprehensive, taking the form of a detailed analysis of the Night Lord's operational methods and their long-term consequences for Imperial governance. Guilliman's assessment concluded that the Legion's approach to compliance was fundamentally flawed because it created conditions that would require permanent military occupation to maintain order. His argument was that worlds brought into compliance through terror alone would never develop the stable governmental structures necessary for effective integration into the Imperium. The escalation of violence within the Night Lord's Legion was not limited to their treatment of enemy populations, but extended to their interactions with Imperial allies and even their own Gene sons. During the joint operation to bring the Lair system into compliance, Night Lord's units clashed with Emperor's Children forces over the treatment of captured Xenos specimens. The Emperor's Children sought to study the alien creatures to understand their biology and culture, while the Night Lords demanded immediate execution of all prisoners as a demonstration of Imperial power. The confrontation escalated when a Night Lord's terror squad executed a group of Lair prisoners that had been designated for study by the Emperor's Children's apothecaries. The killings were carried out in a particularly brutal manner, with the Xenos being flayed alive and their remains displayed as trophies despite explicit orders from the Joint Command structure to preserve the specimens for analysis. The incident created lasting animosity between the two legions and demonstrated the Night Lords' growing disregard for Imperial military protocols. The breakdown of discipline within the 8th Legion manifested in increasingly frequent incidents of unauthorized violence against Imperial citizens and Allied forces. Night Lord squads began to interpret their mandate to eliminate criminal elements as permission to execute anyone they deemed morally deficient, regardless of whether such individuals had actually committed crimes. The criteria for these executions became increasingly arbitrary, with some Astartes targeting civilians for infractions as minor as black market trading or failure to display sufficient enthusiasm for Imperial propaganda. The recruitment practices that had brought Nostraman criminals into the Legion's ranks began to produce unintended consequences as these individuals rose through the ranks to positions of authority. Squad leaders who had been gang enforcers on their homeworld brought with them the casual brutality and predatory instincts that had characterized their previous careers. These officers encouraged their subordinates to view civilian populations as prey rather than subjects to be protected, creating a culture within the Legion that celebrated cruelty for its own sake rather than as a tool for achieving tactical objectives. The rise of sadistic elements within the Night Lords was exemplified by the emergence of specialized units known as Flesh Takers, squads that competed with each other to see who could inflict the most creative tortures on captured enemies. These units developed elaborate rituals around the process of flaying, creating ceremonies that transformed what had once been a practical method of psychological warfare into a form of religious observance. The Flesh Takers maintained detailed records of their victims, cataloging the methods of torture employed and the duration of suffering inflicted as if they were scholarly achievements. The influence of these sadistic elements spread throughout the Legion as their methods proved effective at terrorizing enemy populations and achieving rapid compliance. Officers who had initially been reluctant to employ such extreme tactics found themselves adopting similar approaches as they witnessed the results achieved by their more brutal colleagues. The competitive nature of the Legion's culture meant that those who failed to match the extremes of their peers were viewed as weak or ineffective, creating pressure for all Night Lords to escalate their use of violence. The psychological conditioning that had been designed to eliminate moral qualms about necessary violence began to fail as the Legion's operational parameters expanded beyond their original scope. The hypno-indoctrination procedures that had prepared Night Lords to kill criminals and enemy combatants had not accounted for the systematic torture of civilians or the execution of individuals based on prophetic visions of future crimes. The breakdown of these psychological safeguards created a situation where many Night Lords were operating without any internal constraints on their behavior. The development of new torture techniques became a form of intellectual pursuit within the Legion, with apothecaries and techmarines collaborating to create devices and methods that could prolong suffering while keeping victims alive for extended periods. These innovations were justified as necessary tools for extracting information from captured enemies, but they were often employed purely for the gratification of their operators. The technical sophistication of these torture devices reflected the same attention to detail that characterized other aspects of Night Lord's operations, but applied to purposes that served no tactical objective. The internal culture of the Night Lord's Legion began to reflect the criminal organizations from which many of its members had been recruited, with informal hierarchies based on reputation for violence and the ability to inspire fear in subordinates. These shadow command structures operated parallel to the official military hierarchy, creating situations where orders from legitimate officers could be overruled by individuals who possessed greater psychological dominance within their units. The result was a gradual erosion of military discipline that made the Legion increasingly difficult to control. The practice of taking trophies from victims expanded beyond the traditional collection of flayed skin to include other body parts and personal effects that held symbolic significance. Night Lords began to decorate their armor with fingers, teeth, and scalps taken from particularly notable victims, creating a visual record of their crimes that served both as personal decoration and as a method of intimidating new opponents. The display of these trophies became competitive, with individual Astartes seeking to outdo their comrades in the gruesomeness of their collections. The psychological impact of these practices on the Night Lords themselves was profound and largely unrecognized by their leadership. The constant exposure to extreme violence and the pressure to participate in increasingly brutal activities created a form of psychological conditioning that made normal human emotions and relationships impossible to maintain. Many Night Lords found themselves unable to experience satisfaction from anything other than the infliction of pain, creating a dependency on violence that went far beyond tactical necessity. The corruption of the Legion's original mission became apparent during the compliance of Chthon, where Night Lords units began executing civilians, not because they were criminals or enemies of the Imperium, but simply because the process of killing had become psychologically necessary for the Astartes involved. The executions were carried out with elaborate ceremony, with victims being tortured for days before being killed in ways designed to maximize their suffering. The tactical justification for these actions was minimal, with the operations serving primarily to satisfy the psychological needs of their perpetrators. The response of Imperial authorities to reports of Night Lords' atrocities was initially muted, as the Legion's effectiveness in achieving compliance was difficult to dispute despite their methods. Worlds that had been brought into Imperial control by the Night Lords remained pacified through fear, with crime rates dropping to negligible levels and resistance movements failing to develop. The practical success of their operations made it difficult for Imperial commanders to justify disciplinary action against the Legion, even as reports of their excesses continued to accumulate. The Emperor's awareness of the deteriorating situation within the 8th Legion was complicated by his own reliance on their unique capabilities and his understanding of the prophetic burden that was driving Curze toward madness. The Master of Mankind recognized that the Night Lord's methods, while extreme, were producing results that more conventional approaches might not achieve. The systematic elimination of criminal elements and the creation of compliant populations through terror were serving the broader goals of the Great Crusade, even if the methods employed were becoming increasingly difficult to justify. The internal struggle between Curze's original desire for justice and his growing compulsion toward cruelty manifested in periods of self-awareness where he recognized the monster he was becoming. During these moments of clarity, he would attempt to reassert control over his Legion and return to the more focused application of terror tactics that had characterized their early operations. However, these efforts were undermined by the prophetic visions that continued to show him the futility of his attempts at reform and the inevitable corruption of everything he sought to protect. The knowledge that his own actions were contributing to the very problems he had originally sought to solve created a psychological feedback loop that accelerated his descent into madness. Each attempt to use fear as a tool for creating justice resulted in greater levels of violence and suffering, which in turn generated more visions of future atrocities that would stem from his current actions. The realization that he was trapped in a cycle of escalating brutality from which there was no escape drove him further from rationality and closer to the complete abandonment of moral constraints. The transformation of the Night Lords from a force of arbitrary terror into active traitors against the Imperium they had once served was not a sudden decision, but the inevitable culmination of years of psychological deterioration and philosophical disillusionment. Konrad Curze's prophetic visions had shown him the coming civil war in excruciating detail, revealing not only the broad strokes of the conflict, but the specific moments when each of his brothers would make their fateful choices. The knowledge that the Imperium was doomed to tear itself apart through betrayal and bloodshed created a fatalistic acceptance of his role in the galaxy's destruction, transforming him from a reluctant participant in the Great Crusade into an active agent of its downfall. The first concrete indication of Curze's alignment with the forces of rebellion came during the War Master's secret conclave on Davin, where Horus had gathered those Primarchs he believed could be turned against the Emperor. Curze's presence at this gathering was not the result of corruption by chaos, but rather his acceptance of the inevitable nature of the conflict his visions had revealed. He listened to Horus's arguments about the Emperor's betrayal of the Primarchs and the need for a new order in the galaxy, with the detached interest of someone who already knew the outcome of the conversation. The War Master's attempts to convince Curze to join the rebellion were complicated by the Night Haunter's prophetic knowledge of how the civil war would ultimately unfold. Curze knew that Horus would fail in his attempt to overthrow the Emperor, that the Siege of Terra would end in the War Master's death and the Emperor's entombment upon the Golden Throne. This knowledge made him immune to Horus's promises of victory and power, but it also made him indifferent to the moral arguments that might have swayed other Primarchs away from rebellion. The philosophical framework that Curze used to justify his participation in the Heresy was built around the concept of accelerating the inevitable. His visions had shown him that the Imperium would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions and the corruption of its leaders. By joining the rebellion, he reasoned, he was simply hastening the arrival of a future that could not be prevented, sparing the galaxy the prolonged agony of a slow decline into chaos and despair. This fatalistic logic allowed him to embrace his role as a destroyer while maintaining the illusion that he was performing a necessary service. The Night Lord's participation in the drop site massacre at Istvan V demonstrated the Legion's complete abandonment of their original mission to protect Imperial citizens and enforce justice. The operation required the 8th Legion to turn their weapons against loyalist Space Marines who had served alongside them during the Great Crusade, transforming former allies into enemies through a single act of treachery. The psychological preparation for this betrayal had been underway for months, with Night Lord's officers conditioning their troops to view the loyalist legions as obstacles to the greater good rather than brothers in arms. The tactical planning for the drop site massacre revealed the Night Lord's expertise in psychological warfare adapted for use against fellow Astartes. The Legion's intelligence specialists had spent weeks analyzing the behavioral patterns and tactical doctrines of the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard, identifying psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited during the ambush. The Night Lords understood that the Loyalist forces would be expecting treachery from some quarters, but would be unprepared for the systematic nature of the betrayal that awaited them. The execution of the massacre itself showcased the Night Lords' capacity for coordinated violence on a massive scale. Their terror squads, which had been designed to eliminate criminal leaders and demoralize enemy populations, proved equally effective at targeting the command structures of Loyalist forces. The Legion's flensing specialists, who had honed their skills on countless civilian victims, applied their expertise to the systematic mutilation of wounded Loyalist Astartes, creating scenes of carnage that would haunt the survivors for the remainder of their lives. The psychological impact of the drop site massacre on the Night Lords themselves was profound and largely unexpected by their leadership. Many of the Legion's Terran-born veterans, who had retained some connection to their original purpose as protectors of humanity, experienced severe psychological trauma from participating in the slaughter of their former allies. The cognitive dissonance between their conditioning as defenders of the Imperium and their actions as traitors created a mental fracture that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior and a complete abandonment of any remaining moral constraints. The aftermath of Istvan V saw the Night Lords embracing their new identity as enemies of the Imperium with an enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. The Legion's iconography was modified to reflect their new allegiance, with imperial eagles being defaced or replaced with symbols of death and terror. The practice of taking trophies from fallen enemies expanded to include the power armor and weapons of loyalist Astartes, creating a visual record of their betrayal that served both as personal decoration and as psychological warfare against any loyalist forces they might encounter. The Night Lords' participation in the Thrama's crusade represented their most significant military contribution to the Heresy, as they engaged in a prolonged campaign against the Dark Angels Legion that prevented the First Legion from reinforcing the defense of Terra. The strategic importance of this operation was not lost on Curze, who recognized that his legion's role in the Civil War was to serve as a distraction rather than a decisive force. The knowledge that their efforts would ultimately prove meaningless in the face of Horus's inevitable defeat created a nihilistic approach to the campaign that manifested in increasingly brutal tactics. The opening phases of the Thrama's crusade demonstrated the Night Lords' adaptation of their terror tactics for use against a loyalist Space Marine legion. The Dark Angels' rigid adherence to codified tactical doctrines and their emphasis on honor and duty created psychological vulnerabilities that the Night Lords exploited with ruthless efficiency. The 8th Legion's approach to the campaign involved systematic attacks on Dark Angels' supply lines, communication networks, and recruitment facilities, creating a climate of uncertainty and paranoia that undermined the 1st Legion's operational effectiveness. The Night Lords' use of civilian populations as weapons during the Thrama's crusade marked a new low in their descent into depravity. The Legion began systematically targeting civilian settlements in Dark Angels-controlled systems, not for strategic purposes, but to force the Loyalist forces into defensive positions where they could be more easily engaged. The massacre of entire planetary populations served no tactical objective beyond creating moral dilemmas for the Dark Angels, who were forced to choose between protecting civilians and pursuing military objectives. The psychological warfare campaign that the Night Lords conducted against the Dark Angels involved the systematic corruption of the First Legion's recruitment worlds and the elimination of their cultural traditions. Night Lords' infiltration specialists spent months on planets like Caliban spreading propaganda that portrayed the Dark Angels as failures who had abandoned their homeworld to pursue personal glory. These operations were designed to undermine the loyalty of potential recruits and create internal divisions within the Dark Angels' ranks. The relationship between the Night Lords and other traitor legions during the Heresy was characterized by mutual distrust and competing objectives. The Word-bearers' religious fervor and their worship of the Chaos Gods was viewed with contempt by Curze, who saw their faith as another form of delusion that prevented them from accepting the harsh realities of existence. The Night Lords' nihilistic philosophy and their rejection of any higher purpose beyond the infliction of suffering-created tensions with legions that had embraced chaos as a path to power or enlightenment. The World Eater's descent into mindless violence provided a disturbing mirror for the Night Lords' own psychological deterioration. Curze observed the transformation of Angron's legion with a mixture of fascination and horror, recognizing in their berserker rage a reflection of his own legion's abandonment of rational thought. The difference between the two legions lay not in their capacity for violence, but in their approach to it, with the World Eaters embracing rage as a form of liberation, while the Night Lords maintained their calculated cruelty as a tool of psychological domination. The Iron Warriors' pragmatic approach to warfare and their focus on achieving strategic objectives, regardless of moral considerations, created a natural affinity with the Night Lords' methods. Both legions had abandoned any pretense of fighting for noble causes, instead embracing their roles as instruments of destruction. The collaboration between the 4th and 8th Legions during several joint operations demonstrated their shared understanding that the Heresy was not about ideology, but about the inevitable collapse of the Imperial dream. The confrontations between Curze and his loyalist brothers during the Civil War revealed the extent of his psychological deterioration and his complete abandonment of the values that had once motivated his vigilante activities on Nostramo. His encounter with Vulcan of the Salamanders on the world of Karatan demonstrated the fundamental philosophical differences that had developed between the Primarchs. Where Vulcan sought to protect civilian populations and minimize collateral damage, Curze viewed such concerns as sentimental weaknesses that prevented the application of necessary force. The torture and apparent murder of Vulcan by Curze represented the complete inversion of the Night Haunter's original mission to protect the innocent from predators. The Salamander's Primarch's commitment to defending civilian populations made him a target for Curze's rage, as his brother's nobility served as a constant reminder of the ideals that the Night Haunter had abandoned. The systematic torture that Curze inflicted on Vulcan was not motivated by tactical considerations, but by a psychological need to destroy the living embodiment of the heroic ideal that he had failed to achieve. The discovery of Vulcan's perpetual nature and his ability to regenerate from death created a unique opportunity for Curze to indulge his sadistic impulses without the limitation of a finite victim. The repeated killing and resurrection of his brother became a form of psychological experiment, as Curze sought to determine whether even a Primarch's will could be broken through the application of sufficient suffering. The knowledge that Vulcan would continue to return no matter how many times he was killed created a perfect victim for the Night Haunter's compulsions. The Night Lord's actions during the Heresy were not motivated by the promise of power or the corruption of chaos, but by a nihilistic acceptance of the galaxy's inevitable descent into darkness. Unlike other traitor legions that had been seduced by the offerings of the ruinous powers, the 8th Legion remained largely untouched by demonic influence, their corruption being purely psychological rather than spiritual. This distinction made them particularly dangerous, as their actions were driven by calculated malice rather than the madness that characterized other chaos forces. The strategic role of the Night Lords in the broader Heresy was to serve as a force of disruption and terror that would prevent loyalist forces from coordinating effective resistance. Their campaigns were designed not to achieve decisive victories, but to create conditions of chaos and fear that would undermine the Imperium's ability to respond to the rebellion. The Legion's expertise in psychological warfare made them ideal for this role, as they could achieve strategic objectives through the application of terror rather than through direct military confrontation. The knowledge that their efforts would ultimately prove futile in the face of Horus's defeat created a self-destructive element in the Night Lord's approach to the Heresy. Many of the Legion's operations seemed designed more to inflict maximum suffering than to achieve meaningful strategic objectives, reflecting their Primarch's fatalistic acceptance of the rebellion's inevitable failure. This nihilistic approach to warfare made the Night Lords unpredictable allies for the other traitor legions, as their actions were often counterproductive to the broader goals of the rebellion. The psychological toll of the Heresy on the Night Lords was compounded by their awareness that they were fighting for a cause that they knew was doomed to failure. The knowledge that their betrayal of the Imperium would ultimately accomplish nothing beyond the creation of additional suffering created a form of existential despair that manifested in increasingly extreme acts of violence. The Legion's descent into sadistic brutality during the Civil War represented not a corruption of their original purpose, but the logical conclusion of their founders' philosophical journey from justice to nihilism. The withdrawal of the Night Lords from the main theaters of the Horus Heresy marked the beginning of their most destructive phase, as Konrad Curze led his legion into the eastern fringe, where imperial defenses were stretched thin and oversight from Terra was minimal. The 8th Legion's departure from coordinated traitor operations was not a strategic retreat, but a calculated decision to maximize the suffering they could inflict upon imperial worlds while avoiding the direct confrontations that would inevitably lead to their destruction. Curze's prophetic visions had shown him that the heresy would ultimately fail, but they had also revealed the opportunities for widespread carnage that would present themselves in the outer reaches of the galaxy. The Eastern Fringe provided an ideal hunting ground for the Night Lord's campaign of terror, containing hundreds of worlds that had been brought into Imperial compliance during the Great Crusade, but lacked the military infrastructure necessary to defend against a coordinated assault by a Space Marine Legion. These systems were typically defended by PDF forces and small Imperial Guard garrisons, with the nearest Space Marine chapters often being months away through warp travel. The isolation of these worlds made them perfect targets for the Night Lord's psychological warfare tactics, as news of their attacks would spread slowly through Imperial communication networks, creating a climate of fear that would precede their actual arrival. The selection of target worlds followed a pattern that reflected both tactical considerations and Curze's deteriorating mental state. The Night Lords prioritized systems with large civilian populations that could be terrorized, industrial capacity that could be destroyed to deny resources to the Imperium, and symbolic value that would maximize the psychological impact of their attacks. Worlds that had been held up as examples of successful Imperial integration became particular targets, as their destruction would demonstrate the futility of loyalty to the Emperor and the inevitability of the Imperium's collapse. The attack on Nostramo Quintus, the Night Lord's own recruitment world, represented the ultimate expression of their nihilistic philosophy. Curze had witnessed through his visions the continued corruption of his homeworld, despite his earlier efforts to cleanse it of criminal influence. The noble houses had reconstituted themselves after his departure, the criminal organizations had reformed under new leadership, and the cycle of exploitation and violence had resumed as if his reign of terror had never occurred. The knowledge that his life's work had been meaningless drove him to order the complete destruction of the world that had created him. The orbital bombardment of Nostramo was conducted with methodical precision, with Night Lord strike cruisers systematically targeting the planet's hive cities and industrial complexes. The bombardment was not designed to achieve rapid planetary destruction, but to maximize the suffering of the population, with residential areas being targeted first to create panic before the destruction of infrastructure and government facilities. The process took weeks to complete, with the Night Lords maintaining a constant barrage that prevented any effective evacuation or resistance, while ensuring that the planet's death throes would be as prolonged and agonizing as possible. The psychological impact of witnessing their homeworld's destruction on the Night Lords themselves was profound and largely destructive. Many of the Legion's Nostraman recruits experienced complete psychological breakdown as they watched their birthworld burn, their conditioning failing to protect them from the trauma of participating in genocide against their own people. The Terran-born veterans of the Legion responded with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction, recognizing the destruction of Nostramo as the logical conclusion of their Primarch's philosophy, but also understanding that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The campaign against the Cherout system demonstrated the Night Lords' adaptation of their terror tactics for use against multiple worlds simultaneously. The system contained 7 inhabited planets, each with populations ranging from 50 million to 2 billion souls, connected by regular shipping routes that facilitated trade and communication. The Night Lords' approach to the system involved the systematic isolation of each world through the destruction of orbital facilities and communication arrays, creating conditions where the population of each planet would be aware that their neighbors were under attack, but unable to coordinate resistance or evacuation efforts. The assault on Cherout Prime began with the infiltration of the planet's capital city by Night Lords reconnaissance specialists who had been trained in the methods of criminal organizations. These operatives spent several weeks gathering intelligence on the planet's power structures, identifying key government officials, military commanders, and civilian leaders who could be targeted for elimination. The information gathered during this phase allowed the Night Lords to develop a comprehensive understanding of the planet's psychological vulnerabilities and the methods that would be most effective for creating widespread panic. The elimination phase of the Cherout Prime operation was conducted over a period of 3 months, with Night Lords terror squads systematically targeting the planet's leadership while conducting increasingly brutal attacks on civilian populations. The methods employed during these operations represented a refinement of techniques that had been developed during the Legion's earlier campaigns, with each attack designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing the resources required for execution. The Night Lord's use of flayed skin as psychological warfare reached new levels of sophistication, with entire districts being decorated with the remains of executed civilians as a form of territorial marking. The industrial world of Mordian Hive became a testing ground for the Night Lord's development of new torture techniques and execution methods. The planet's population of 300 million was concentrated in massive hive cities that provided ideal conditions for the systematic application of terror tactics. The Night Lord's approach to the world involved the capture and conversion of the planet's industrial facilities into torture chambers and execution sites, transforming the machinery that had once produced goods for the Imperium into instruments of systematic murder. The development of industrial-scale torture methods on Mordian Hive represented a new evolution in the Night Lord's descent into depravity. The Legion's Techmarines collaborated with captured industrial engineers to modify production line equipment for the systematic processing of human victims, creating assembly lines of death that could torture and kill thousands of individuals per day. These facilities were designed not just to eliminate the planet's population, but to do so in ways that would create maximum psychological trauma for those who witnessed the process. The documentation of these torture methods was maintained by Night Lord specialists who treated the systematic murder of civilians as a form of scientific research. Detailed records were kept of the effectiveness of different torture techniques, the psychological responses of victims to various forms of abuse, and the optimal methods for prolonging suffering while maintaining the victim's consciousness. These records were compiled into treatises that were distributed throughout the Legion as training materials, institutionalizing the systematic application of cruelty as a core component of Night Lord's doctrine. The strategic purpose behind the Night Lord's campaign of terror extended beyond simple destruction to encompass the systematic undermining of Imperial morale and the diversion of resources from more critical theaters of war. Each world that fell to the 8th Legion required the deployment of Imperial forces to investigate the attacks, provide humanitarian aid to survivors, and establish new defensive positions to prevent further incursions. The cumulative effect of these operations was to strain the Imperium's already overstretched military resources while creating a climate of fear that undermined civilian confidence in Imperial protection. The psychological warfare campaign conducted by the Night Lords involved the systematic dissemination of propaganda that portrayed the Imperium as unable to protect its citizens from the forces of darkness. Survivors of Night Lords' attacks were often deliberately spared so that they could spread accounts of the atrocities they had witnessed, creating a network of terror that extended far beyond the worlds that had been directly attacked. The stories told by these survivors became increasingly exaggerated through repetition, creating legends of Night Lord's cruelty that were often more effective than the actual attacks in creating fear and despair. The impact of the Night Lord's terror campaign on Imperial military planning was significant and far-reaching. The unpredictable nature of their attacks forced Imperial commanders to maintain defensive forces in hundreds of systems that might potentially be targeted, preventing the concentration of forces that would be necessary for effective offensive operations. The psychological effect of the Night Lord's reputation also influenced the behavior of Imperial forces, with many units becoming reluctant to engage in operations that might expose them to retaliation from the 8th Legion. The isolation of Konrad Curze from his fellow traitor Primarchs became increasingly pronounced as the Night Lord's campaign progressed. The other leaders of the rebellion viewed the 8th Legion's activities as counterproductive to the broader goals of overthrowing the Emperor, arguing that the systematic murder of Imperial civilians was creating unnecessary resistance while providing no strategic advantage. The Night Lords' focus on terror tactics rather than military objectives made them unreliable allies who could not be counted upon to support coordinated operations. The philosophical differences between Curze and the other traitor Primarchs became apparent during the few occasions when they attempted to coordinate their activities. Horus's vision of a new galactic order required the preservation of Imperial infrastructure and the conversion of existing populations to the cause of rebellion. The Night Lords' systematic destruction of worlds and their elimination of civilian populations was directly contrary to these objectives, creating tensions that could not be resolved through negotiation or compromise. The growing independence of the Night Lords' Legion from the broader traitor cause was reflected in their adoption of increasingly esoteric operational procedures and their development of internal hierarchies that ignored the chain of command established by the War Master. Night Lords' companies began operating as independent entities that reported directly to their Primarch rather than coordinating with other traitor forces, creating a fragmented command structure that made the Legion difficult to control or predict. The recruitment practices employed by the Night Lords during their terror campaign represented a complete abandonment of the standards that had once governed Space Marine selection. The Legion began accepting candidates from the criminal populations of conquered worlds, individuals who possessed the psychological profile necessary for the systematic application of terror tactics, but lacked the discipline and loyalty that had once characterized Astartes' recruitment. These new recruits brought with them the casual brutality and predatory instincts of their criminal backgrounds, accelerating the Legion's descent into uncontrolled violence. The development of specialized terror units within the Night Lords reflected the Legion's evolution from a military force into something resembling a criminal organization. These units operated according to principles borrowed from the gangs and cartels that had once controlled Nostramo, with territory being divided among competing groups that vied for the most spectacular displays of cruelty. The competitive nature of these arrangements created an escalating cycle of violence as individual units sought to outdo their rivals in the brutality of their operations. The logistical challenges of maintaining a terror campaign across multiple star systems required the Night Lords to develop new methods of resource acquisition and fleet management. The Legion's supply lines were maintained through systematic piracy and the looting of conquered worlds, with captured vessels being pressed into service as auxiliary ships for the Night Lords' fleet. The crews of these vessels were typically drawn from the criminal populations of conquered worlds, creating a navy that operated according to the principles of organized crime rather than military discipline. The psychological toll of the prolonged terror campaign on the Night Lords themselves manifested in increasingly erratic behavior and the complete breakdown of military discipline. Many of the Legion's veterans began experiencing hallucinations and psychological episodes that interfered with their ability to function effectively in combat situations. The constant exposure to extreme violence and the pressure to participate in increasingly brutal activities created a form of psychological conditioning that made normal human emotions impossible to experience. The fragmentation of the Night Lords' Legion into competing factions reflected the breakdown of central authority that had characterized their descent into criminality. Individual companies began operating according to their own agendas, with some focusing on the systematic torture of civilian populations, while others concentrated on the destruction of Imperial infrastructure. The lack of coordination between these different factions made the Legion's operations increasingly unpredictable and difficult to counter through conventional military means. The evolution of the Night Lords' tactical doctrines during the terror campaign demonstrated their adaptation to the challenges of operating without support from other Imperial forces. The Legion developed new methods of planetary assault that emphasized speed and psychological impact over military effectiveness, creating operations that could achieve maximum terror with minimal expenditure of resources. These tactics were designed to allow small Night Lord's forces to terrorize entire worlds through the strategic application of violence against carefully selected targets. The legacy of the Night Lord's terror campaign in the Eastern Fringe would extend far beyond the immediate destruction they caused, creating a climate of fear and despair that would influence Imperial policy for centuries to come. The knowledge that an entire Space Marine Legion had turned against the populations they were sworn to protect created a crisis of confidence in the Imperial military that would never be fully resolved. The methods employed by the Night Lords during their campaign would become the standard against which all future acts of military brutality would be measured, establishing a benchmark for systematic cruelty that would haunt the Imperium's collective memory. The news of Nostramo's regression reached Konrad Curze through fragmentary astropathic transmissions and the reports of Night Lords recruitment vessels that had returned from the homeworld, with increasingly disturbing accounts of the planet's condition. What they described bore little resemblance to the world that the Night Haunter had left behind decades earlier, when his reign of terror had supposedly cleansed the criminal elements from Nostramo's hive cities. The noble houses had reconstituted themselves within years of his departure, emerging from hidden strongholds and off-world assets to reclaim their positions of power. The criminal organizations that had once cowered in the Underhive's deepest recesses had reformed under new leadership, establishing territories and protection rackets that operated with even greater boldness than their predecessors. The systematic nature of Nostramo's return to corruption was evident in the detailed intelligence reports compiled by Night Lord's reconnaissance teams. House Krieg had not only resumed control of the planet's adamantium mining operations, but had expanded their influence to encompass the orbital processing stations that refined raw materials for export to Imperial Forge worlds. Their methods had become more sophisticated during the intervening years, incorporating lessons learned from the Night Haunter's earlier campaign to create more resilient power structures that could survive future attempts at elimination. The family's leadership had been distributed across multiple locations, with succession plans and backup command structures that ensured continuity even if key figures were assassinated. House Vander had similarly adapted their food distribution networks to account for the possibility of future disruption, establishing redundant supply chains and hidden stockpiles that could maintain their control over the population even during periods of conflict. Their stranglehold on nutrition had become more complete than ever before, with the family controlling not just the distribution of food, but also the production facilities and agricultural zones that supplied the hive cities. The systematic malnutrition that characterized the lower levels of Nostramo's social hierarchy had worsened significantly, with mortality rates among the working classes reaching levels that would have been considered catastrophic on other Imperial worlds. The criminal organizations that had emerged in the power vacuum left by the Night Haunter's departure had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors, developing more sophisticated methods of avoiding detection and eliminating threats to their operations. The Crimson Fang had evolved from a simple gang into a planet-wide criminal syndicate that operated through a network of cells and front organizations, making it virtually impossible to eliminate through the targeted assassination techniques that had proven so effective against earlier criminal leaders. Their operations had expanded beyond simple extortion and murder to encompass drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and the systematic exploitation of industrial workers. The Bone Merchants had transformed their organ harvesting operations into a sophisticated medical industry that supplied biological components to off-world clients throughout the sector. Their facilities had been upgraded with stolen Imperial medical technology, allowing them to process victims with industrial efficiency while maintaining the quality standards demanded by their customers. The organization's influence had spread throughout Nostromo's medical establishment, with legitimate hospitals and clinics serving as fronts for their illegal activities, while providing cover for the systematic murder of patients whose organs were deemed valuable. The Shadow Cartel had established itself as the primary distributor of illegal substances throughout the Nostramo system, operating smuggling networks that extended to neighboring star systems and provided drugs to criminal organizations across the Eastern Fringe. Their operations had become so extensive that they were effectively competing with legitimate Imperial trade routes, using their profits to corrupt local officials and purchase advanced weapons that made them capable of challenging Imperial authority directly. The cartel's leadership had learned from the Night Haunter's methods, adopting similar terror tactics to maintain control over their territory while avoiding the philosophical constraints that had limited his effectiveness. The planetary government that had been established following Nostromo's integration into the Imperium had been thoroughly corrupted by these criminal elements, with officials at every level receiving payments in exchange for ignoring illegal activities or actively facilitating criminal operations. The Imperial governor appointed to oversee the planet's administration had been systematically isolated from accurate information about conditions on Nostramo, receiving reports that portrayed the world as a model of Imperial compliance, while the reality was a descent into chaos that surpassed even the darkest periods of the planet's pre-compliance history. The recruitment of new Night Lords from Nostromo's population had become increasingly difficult as the quality of candidates declined in response to the planet's deteriorating conditions. The criminal organizations that now controlled the recruitment zones had learned to identify potential Space Marine candidates and either eliminate them as threats or corrupt them before they could be selected for the Legion. The few candidates who did reach the Night Lord's recruitment vessels were often so psychologically damaged by their experiences that they proved unsuitable for the gene seed implantation process, creating a crisis in the Legion's ability to maintain its strength through new recruits. The industrial output that had once made Nostramo valuable to the Imperium had declined significantly as criminal organizations prioritized short-term profits over long-term productivity. The adamantium mines that had operated for millennia were being strip-mined without regard for structural integrity, creating conditions that made further extraction increasingly dangerous and expensive. The manufacturing facilities that had produced weapons and equipment for the Imperial war effort were being systematically looted of their most valuable components, with the stolen materials being sold to off-world buyers who paid higher prices than the Imperial procurement agencies. The environmental degradation that had characterized Nostramo during the Night Haunter's youth had accelerated dramatically in the absence of any effective oversight. The planet's already toxic atmosphere had become even more polluted as industrial facilities operated without environmental controls, creating conditions that were barely compatible with human life even in the hive city's upper levels. The water supplies that had once been contaminated but usable had become completely poisonous, forcing the population to rely on expensive purification systems that were controlled by criminal organizations and used as tools of coercion. The social fabric of Nostramo had deteriorated to the point where the concept of law had become meaningless, except as a tool of oppression wielded by those with sufficient power to enforce their will. The arbitrator stations that had once provided some semblance of justice had been abandoned or converted into criminal strongholds, with their former occupants either killed or corrupted into serving the interests of the various criminal factions. The public executions that had once served as demonstrations of Imperial authority had been replaced by elaborate torture spectacles organized by criminal leaders as entertainment for their followers. The religious institutions that had maintained a minimal presence on Nostramo had been thoroughly corrupted by the planet's criminal culture, with many temples serving as fronts for illegal activities or meeting places for criminal organizations. The few priests who had attempted to maintain legitimate religious practices had been eliminated or driven off-world, leaving behind a spiritual vacuum that was filled by the worship of violence and the glorification of criminal success. The imperial cult as practiced on Nostramo had become a parody of its original form, with sermons that praised the emperor's capacity for violence while ignoring his role as protector of humanity. The educational system that had once provided basic literacy and technical training to the working classes had collapsed entirely, with schools being converted into criminal recruiting centers or abandoned altogether. The children of Nostramo's lower classes were now raised without any formal education, learning only the skills necessary for survival in the planet's violent environment. The literacy rates that had improved during the early years of imperial rule had plummeted to levels that were lower than those that had existed before the planet's compliance, creating a population that was increasingly isolated from the broader imperial culture. The transportation networks that had once connected Nostramo's various hive cities had been systematically sabotaged or converted into smuggling routes controlled by criminal organizations. The maintenance of these systems had been abandoned as the various factions focused on short-term exploitation rather than long-term infrastructure development. The result was a gradual isolation of different regions of the planet, with each hive city becoming an independent criminal fiefdom that operated according to its own rules and priorities. The communication systems that had once allowed for planetary coordination had been compromised by criminal organizations that used them to coordinate their activities while preventing legitimate authorities from accessing accurate information about conditions throughout the planet. The astropathic facilities that connected Nostramo to the broader Imperium had been infiltrated by criminal elements who filtered outgoing messages to prevent reports of the planet's true condition from reaching Imperial authorities. The isolation created by these communication failures had allowed the criminal organizations to operate with impunity while maintaining the facade of Imperial compliance. The military forces that had once maintained order on Nostramo had been systematically corrupted or eliminated by criminal organizations that viewed them as obstacles to their operations. The planetary defense forces had been reduced to a shadow of their former strength, with most units being composed of criminals who used their official positions to facilitate illegal activities. The few honest officers who had attempted to maintain military discipline had been assassinated or forced to flee off-world, leaving behind a military establishment that was indistinguishable from the criminal organizations it was supposed to combat. The orbital defense platforms that protected Nostramo from external threats had been neglected to the point where they were barely functional, with their weapon systems being cannibalized for parts that could be sold to off-world buyers. The crews that operated these facilities had been recruited from criminal organizations rather than legitimate military sources, creating a situation where the planet's defenses were controlled by individuals whose loyalty was to their criminal patrons rather than to the Imperium. The systematic degradation of these defenses had left Nostramo vulnerable to attack while simultaneously making it a base for criminal operations that threatened neighboring systems. When Konrad Curze finally returned to witness the extent of his homeworld's regression, the psychological impact was devastating even for someone who had already descended into madness. The prophetic visions that had shown him glimpses of Nostramo's future corruption had not prepared him for the systematic nature of the planet's decay or the complete abandonment of the values that had once motivated his vigilante campaign. The realization that his life's work had been not just meaningless, but actively counterproductive, created a rage that transcended even his previous capacity for violence. The Night Lord's fleet that accompanied their Primarch to Nostramo consisted of 12 strike cruisers and over 40 escort vessels, carrying the remnants of the Legion that had survived their terror campaign in the Eastern Fringe. The fleet's approach to the planet was detected by the orbital defense platforms, but the corrupted crews that operated these facilities made no attempt to challenge the Night Lord's arrival. The criminal organizations that controlled the platforms recognized the Night Lord's iconography and understood that resistance would be futile, instead focusing their efforts on evacuating their most valuable assets and personnel to off-world locations. The initial reconnaissance conducted by Night Lord's infiltration teams confirmed the worst fears about Nostromo's condition, revealing a planet that had become a criminal paradise where every form of vice and exploitation flourished without restraint. The reports compiled by these teams detailed atrocities that shocked even the hardened veterans of the 8th Legion, describing systematic torture, mass murder, and exploitation that exceeded anything they had witnessed during their own campaigns of terror. The realization that their homeworld had become a source of criminals rather than warriors created a crisis of identity within the Legion that would have profound consequences for their future operations. The decision to destroy Nostramo was not made in a moment of rage, but through a calculated assessment of the planet's condition and its impact on the Night Lord's operational effectiveness. Curze recognized that the world could never again serve as a source of suitable recruits for the Legion, and that its continued existence would only provide resources and sanctuary for the criminal elements that had corrupted it. The prophetic visions that had shown him the planet's inevitable decay had also revealed that any attempt to cleanse it through conventional means would be temporary at best, with the criminal organizations simply adapting to whatever methods were employed against them. The orbital bombardment of Nostramo began with the systematic targeting of the planet's communication and transportation infrastructure, ensuring that the population would be unable to coordinate evacuation efforts or resistance to the coming destruction. The Night Lord's gunners had been trained in the precise application of firepower, and they demonstrated their expertise by eliminating specific targets while leaving others intact to maximize the psychological impact on the planet's population. The bombardment was designed not to achieve rapid planetary destruction, but to create a prolonged period of terror that would allow the maximum number of people to understand the nature of their fate. The destruction of Nostromo's hive cities was conducted with methodical precision, with each structure being targeted in a sequence that would maximize the suffering of its inhabitants. The residential areas were struck first, creating panic and confusion that prevented organized evacuation efforts. The industrial zones were targeted next, eliminating the infrastructure that might have provided shelter or resources for survivors. The administrative centers were destroyed last, ensuring that any attempts at coordinated resistance would be impossible, while allowing the planet's leaders to witness the complete destruction of everything they had built. The psychological impact of watching their homeworld burn was devastating for the Night Lords who participated in the bombardment. Many of the Legion's Nostraman recruits experienced complete psychological breakdown as they witnessed the destruction of their birth world, their conditioning proving insufficient to protect them from the trauma of participating in genocide against their own people. The Terran-born veterans of the Legion watched the destruction with grim satisfaction, recognizing it as the logical conclusion of their Primarch's philosophy, while understanding that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return to their original purpose as protectors of humanity. The systematic nature of Nostromo's destruction extended beyond simple bombardment to include the elimination of escape routes and the hunting down of survivors who might have fled to other worlds. Night Lord squadrons were dispatched to neighboring systems to eliminate any Nostraman refugees who might have escaped the planet's destruction, ensuring that the criminal culture that had infected their homeworld would not spread to other Imperial territories. These operations were conducted with the same methodical precision that had characterized the bombardment itself, demonstrating the Night Lord's commitment to the complete elimination of their planet's toxic legacy. The loss of their recruitment base had immediate and long-term consequences for the Night Lord's Legion that extended far beyond the simple reduction in available candidates for gene seed implantation. The destruction of Nostramo eliminated the cultural foundation that had shaped the Legion's identity, forcing them to confront the reality that they were now a dying breed with no hope of replacement or renewal. The psychological impact of this realization was compounded by the knowledge that their homeworld's destruction had been necessary, creating a form of existential despair that would influence every aspect of their future operations. The destruction of Nostramo sent shockwaves throughout the Imperium that extended far beyond the immediate strategic implications of losing a recruitment world. The systematic annihilation of an entire planet by its own Primarch represented a level of betrayal that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which the Great Crusade had been built. Imperial commanders who had grown accustomed to the Night Lord's brutal methods were forced to confront the reality that one of the Emperor's sons had crossed a line that separated necessary violence from genocidal madness. The astropathic reports that reached Terra described not just the physical destruction of a world, but the complete moral collapse of an entire Space Marine legion. The Emperor's response to news of Nostramo's destruction was swift and decisive, though it came too late to prevent the catastrophe that Konrad Curze had unleashed upon his homeworld. The Master of Mankind had been monitoring the deteriorating situation within the 8th Legion through intelligence reports and psychic observation, but the sheer scale of the atrocity committed against Nostramo forced him to acknowledge that his 8th son had become a threat that could no longer be contained through paternal intervention or philosophical argument. The decision to authorize military action against the Night Lords was made with the full knowledge that it would likely result in the complete destruction of the Legion and the death of one of his Primarchs. The task of hunting down the Night Lords fell to multiple Imperial agencies working in coordination, each bringing their own expertise to bear on the challenge of tracking and eliminating a Space Marine Legion that had spent decades perfecting the arts of stealth, terror, and psychological warfare. The Imperial Navy committed significant resources to the operation, deploying entire battle groups to patrol the shipping lanes and monitor the warp routes that the Night Lords might use to move between systems. The Officio Assassinorum activated sleeper agents throughout the Eastern Fringe, tasking them with gathering intelligence on Night Lords' movements and identifying potential targets for elimination. The Adeptus Mechanicus contributed their expertise in data analysis and pattern recognition, using their cogitator networks to process the vast amounts of intelligence being gathered about Night Lords' activities. Their analysis revealed that the 8th Legion had fragmented into numerous smaller forces operating independently across dozens of star systems, making it impossible to eliminate them through a single decisive battle. The scattered nature of the Night Lords' operations required a different approach, one that would systematically hunt down each individual warband while preventing them from reuniting into a cohesive force. The intelligence picture that emerged from months of investigation painted a disturbing portrait of a legion that had devolved into something resembling a criminal organization more than a military force. Night Lords' companies were operating as independent raiders, attacking Imperial worlds and shipping with no apparent strategic objective beyond the infliction of suffering. The fragmentation of the Legion's command structure had created a situation where individual captains were making their own decisions about targets and tactics, leading to increasingly unpredictable and brutal attacks throughout the Eastern Fringe. The Imperial response to these scattered attacks involved the deployment of specialized hunter-killer groups designed to track down and eliminate individual Night Lords' warbands. These forces typically consisted of a corps of experienced Space Marines from loyal legions, supported by Imperial Navy vessels equipped with advanced sensor arrays and augmented by Officio Assassinorum operatives trained in anti-Astartes warfare. The composition of these hunter groups reflected the unique challenges posed by their targets, requiring both the firepower necessary to engage Space Marines in direct combat and the stealth capabilities needed to track enemies who were masters of concealment. The Dark Angels Legion played a particularly significant role in the hunt for the Night Lords, their experience during the Thrama's Crusade having given them intimate knowledge of the 8th Legion's tactics and operational procedures. Lion L. Johnson committed substantial resources to the campaign, viewing the elimination of the Night Lords as both a strategic necessity and a personal vendetta arising from their earlier conflicts. The 1st Legion's methodical approach to warfare proved well-suited to the task of hunting scattered enemy forces, with their systematic search patterns and comprehensive intelligence networks gradually closing the net around individual Night Lords' warbands. The Ultramarines contributed their expertise in logistics and coordination, establishing supply bases and communication networks that allowed the various hunter groups to operate effectively across the vast distances of the Eastern Fringe. Robute Guilliman's organizational skills proved invaluable in managing the complex operation, ensuring that intelligence was shared efficiently between different Imperial agencies and that resources were allocated where they would be most effective. The 13th Legion's involvement also provided a psychological dimension to the hunt, as their reputation for honorable conduct served as a stark contrast to the atrocities committed by the Night Lords. The Imperial Fists participated in the operation through their expertise in siege warfare and fortification, establishing defensive positions around key Imperial worlds that might serve as targets for Night Lords' attacks. Rogel Dorn's strategic thinking contributed to the development of defensive doctrines that could protect civilian populations while creating opportunities to engage Night Lords' forces under favorable conditions. The 7th Legion's involvement in the hunt reflected their Primarch's belief that the best defense against terror tactics was the demonstration of Imperial resolve and the protection of innocent lives. The challenges faced by the Imperial forces hunting the Night Lords were compounded by the 8th Legion's intimate knowledge of Imperial military procedures and their ability to exploit weaknesses in the systems designed to track and eliminate them. Many Night Lords veterans had served alongside the very forces now hunting them, giving them detailed knowledge of Imperial tactics, communication protocols, and operational procedures. This familiarity allowed them to anticipate Imperial responses and develop countermeasures that made them extremely difficult to locate and engage. The Night Lords' use of captured Imperial vessels and equipment further complicated the hunt, as it became increasingly difficult to distinguish between legitimate Imperial forces and Night Lords infiltrators. Several incidents occurred where Imperial hunter groups engaged each other after mistaking friendly forces for Night Lords raiders, creating a climate of suspicion and paranoia that interfered with the coordination of the operation. The psychological impact of these friendly fire incidents was significant, as they demonstrated the Night Lords' ability to corrupt Imperial forces even without direct confrontation. The scattered nature of the Night Lords' operations made it impossible to predict their next targets with any degree of accuracy, forcing Imperial commanders to maintain defensive forces across hundreds of star systems, while simultaneously conducting offensive operations against known Night Lords' positions. The resource requirements for this dual approach were enormous, straining the Imperium's already overstretched military capabilities and diverting forces from other critical operations. The economic cost of the hunt was compounded by the destruction caused by Night Lords' attacks, which often targeted industrial facilities and transportation networks that were vital to the Imperial war effort. The psychological warfare campaign conducted by the Night Lords against their Imperial pursuers proved to be one of their most effective tactics, using their reputation for brutality to create fear and hesitation among enemy forces. Intelligence reports described incidents where Imperial forces had discovered the mutilated remains of previous hunter groups, arranged in ways designed to maximize psychological impact on those who found them. These displays served both as warnings to other Imperial forces and as demonstrations of the Night Lords' continued capability despite their scattered condition. The Officio Assassinorum's involvement in the hunt represented a significant escalation in the Imperium's response to the Night Lords' threat. The deployment of assassins against Space Marines was relatively rare, typically reserved for situations where conventional military forces had proven inadequate. The unique challenges posed by the Night Lords, particularly their expertise in stealth and terror tactics, made them ideal targets for assassin intervention. The Officio's various temples contributed their specialized skills to the operation, with each temple's unique capabilities being matched against specific aspects of the Night Lord's threat. The Vindicare Temple provided long-range elimination capabilities, deploying snipers equipped with specialized ammunition designed to penetrate Space Marine armor and neutralize enhanced physiology. These operatives were tasked with eliminating Night Lords leaders and specialists whose deaths would disrupt the Legion's operational capabilities. The precision required for these operations was extraordinary, as the targets were often protected by multiple layers of security and possessed superhuman reflexes that made conventional assassination techniques ineffective. The Calidus Temple contributed their shape-shifting abilities and infiltration expertise, deploying operatives who could assume the identities of Night Lord's personnel or Imperial officials to gather intelligence and create opportunities for elimination. The psychological conditioning that allowed Calidus assassins to maintain their cover identities while operating in extremely hostile environments made them particularly suited to operations against the Night Lords, who were known for their ability to detect and eliminate conventional infiltrators. The Aversir Temple provided shock assault capabilities, deploying combat stimulant-enhanced killers who could match Space Marines in direct combat while maintaining the element of surprise. These operatives were typically used in situations where stealth was impossible or had failed, providing a last resort option for eliminating high-value targets. The psychological impact of Aversir deployments was significant, as even the Night Lords found their reputation for brutality challenged by the systematic violence of these enhanced killers. The Culexus Temple's anti-psychic capabilities proved valuable in operations against Night Lords' forces that included psychers or individuals with latent psychic abilities. The soul-destroying presence of Culexus assassins created a form of terror that was qualitatively different from the fear tactics employed by the Night Lords, representing a negation of existence itself rather than simply the threat of death. The deployment of these operatives was carefully coordinated to maximize their psychological impact while minimizing the risk to other Imperial forces. The hunt for Konrad Curze himself represented the most challenging aspect of the entire operation, as the Night Haunter's prophetic abilities and intimate knowledge of Imperial procedures made him extremely difficult to locate and engage. Intelligence reports suggested that Curze was operating from a mobile base, possibly a modified battle barge or strike cruiser, that moved constantly through the eastern fringe while coordinating the activities of scattered Night Lords' warbands. The Primarch's ability to anticipate Imperial movements through his visions made conventional tracking methods ineffective, requiring the development of new techniques specifically designed to counter his prophetic abilities. The psychological profile developed by Imperial analysts painted a picture of a Primarch who had completely abandoned any pretense of serving the Imperium's interests, instead operating according to a nihilistic philosophy that viewed destruction as an end in itself. The reports described incidents where Curze had personally participated in the torture and execution of Imperial civilians, demonstrating a level of personal involvement in atrocities that exceeded even the worst excesses of other traitor Primarchs. The systematic nature of these crimes suggested that they were not random acts of violence, but components of a larger campaign designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on the Imperium. The Imperial Navy's contribution to the hunt involved the deployment of specialized reconnaissance vessels equipped with advanced sensor arrays and auger systems designed to detect the unique signatures of Night Lords' vessels. These ships operated in coordinated search patterns, gradually mapping the areas where Night Lords' forces were known to operate while identifying potential hiding places and supply bases. The naval component of the operation was complicated by the Night Lords' use of captured Imperial vessels, which made it difficult to distinguish between legitimate shipping and enemy forces. The development of new tactical doctrines specifically designed to counter Night Lords' operations represented a significant evolution in Imperial military thinking. These doctrines emphasized the importance of maintaining unit cohesion in the face of terror tactics, the use of overwhelming firepower to negate the Night Lords' advantages in close combat, and the systematic protection of civilian populations to deny the 8th Legion their preferred targets. The implementation of these doctrines required extensive training and psychological conditioning for Imperial forces, as conventional military preparation was insufficient to prepare troops for the unique challenges posed by Night Lords' operations. The intelligence networks established to track Night Lords' movements gradually began to produce results, identifying patterns in their attacks and movement that allowed Imperial forces to anticipate their next targets. The analysis revealed that despite their apparent randomness, Night Lords' operations followed certain predictable patterns based on their need for supplies, recruitment opportunities, and symbolic targets. This intelligence was used to establish ambush sites and coordinate hunter group deployments, gradually increasing the pressure on the scattered Night Lords' forces. The elimination of individual Night Lords' warbands was typically achieved through coordinated operations that combined multiple Imperial agencies and military units. A typical engagement would begin with intelligence gathering by Assassinorum operatives, followed by the deployment of hunter groups to establish containment, while specialized forces moved in for the elimination phase. The complexity of these operations reflected the formidable nature of the targets, as even a single squad of Night Lords could inflict enormous casualties on conventional Imperial forces if not properly contained and eliminated. The psychological impact of the hunt on Imperial forces was significant and largely negative, as the constant exposure to Night Lords' atrocities and the high casualty rates among hunter groups created a climate of fear and desperation. Many Imperial commanders found themselves adopting increasingly brutal tactics in response to Night Lords' operations, creating a cycle of escalating violence that threatened to corrupt the very forces tasked with eliminating the 8th Legion. The recognition that the hunt was changing the hunters as much as it was eliminating the hunted became a source of concern for Imperial leadership. The fragmentation of the Night Lords' Legion continued throughout the hunt, with individual companies and squads operating independently and often in competition with each other. This fragmentation made the Legion easier to eliminate piecemeal, but also created a situation where the complete destruction of the 8th Legion would require the systematic hunting down of hundreds of individual groups scattered across dozens of star systems. The scale of this task was unprecedented in Imperial military history, requiring resources and coordination that strained the Imperium's capabilities. The final phase of the hunt focused on the elimination of Konrad Curze himself, as Imperial analysts recognized that the Night Haunter's continued existence served as a rallying point for scattered Night Lords' forces and a symbol of the Imperium's inability to bring its enemies to justice. The deployment of the Calidus assassin, Shunned, represented the culmination of years of intelligence gathering and preparation, as the Officio Assassinorum committed their most skilled operative to a mission that would determine the ultimate fate of the Night Lords' Legion. The assassination of Konrad Curze by Shunned on the fortress world of Tsagualsa marked the end of the Night Haunter's reign of terror, but not the conclusion of his dark legacy. The Calidus assassin's successful infiltration of the Primarch's stronghold and her precise execution of the target represented a tactical victory for the Imperium, but the strategic consequences of Curze's death would prove far more complex than Imperial planners had anticipated. The Night Lords' Legion, already fragmented into dozens of independent warbands, did not simply dissolve with the death of their Gene Father, but instead underwent a fundamental transformation that would define their existence for the next 10 millennia. The immediate aftermath of Curze's assassination saw the complete breakdown of what little centralized command structure remained within the Night Lords' Legion. The various company captains and terror lords who had maintained loose coordination under their Primarch's leadership found themselves without a unifying authority, each interpreting Curze's final recorded messages according to their own understanding of his philosophy. The prophetic recordings that the Night Haunter had left behind, predicting his own death and the eventual fate of the Imperium, became sacred texts for some warbands, while others rejected them as the ravings of a madman. This theological schism would create lasting divisions within the Legion that persist into the 41st millennium. The fragmentation process accelerated as individual Night Lords' commanders claimed authority over their immediate followers while rejecting the legitimacy of other leaders' commands. Captain Sahal of the 10th Company declared himself the rightful heir to Curze's legacy, claiming possession of the Corona Nox and asserting his authority over the entire Legion. His claims were disputed by dozens of other commanders, including the notorious Krieg Acerbus, who who had risen to prominence during the terror campaigns in the Eastern Fringe, and Talos Valcorin, whose 10th company had earned a reputation for particularly creative applications of psychological warfare. The resulting power struggles consumed resources and attention that might have been directed toward more effective resistance against Imperial forces. The tactical adaptations that emerged from this fragmentation reflected the diverse interpretations of Curze's teachings and the varying psychological profiles of the Night Lords who survived the Imperial purges. Some warbands, led by veterans who remembered the Legion's original mission to eliminate criminal elements, maintained a focus on targeting corrupt Imperial officials and criminal organizations. These groups, while still employing the brutal methods characteristic of the Night Lords, retained some connection to their founders' original vision of justice through fear. Their operations often involved the systematic elimination of planetary governors, merchant princes, and other figures whose corruption had created suffering among Imperial populations. Other warbands embraced the nihilistic philosophy that had characterized Curze's final years, viewing the Imperium's eventual collapse as inevitable and their role as merely accelerating the process. These groups conducted raids that seemed designed purely to inflict suffering without any strategic objective, targeting civilian populations and infrastructure with methods that exceeded even the Night Lords' previous standards of brutality. The psychological conditioning that had once focused their violence on specific targets had broken down entirely, replaced by a compulsive need to inflict pain that served no purpose beyond its own satisfaction. The most successful Night Lords warbands adapted their operations to exploit the changing nature of the Imperium in the millennia following the Horus Heresy. The increasing bureaucratization of Imperial administration created new opportunities for the application of terror tactics, as the complex hierarchies and communication networks that governed Imperial worlds provided numerous points of vulnerability. Night Lords specialists developed expertise in infiltrating Imperial institutions, using their understanding of fear and intimidation to manipulate officials and extract information about potential targets. These infiltration operations often took years to complete, with individual Night Lords assuming false identities and gradually working their way into positions of trust before revealing their true nature. The recruitment practices employed by Night Lords warbands during the Long War reflected both the practical necessities of maintaining their forces and the philosophical evolution of their approach to warfare. Without access to the gene seed production facilities of a loyal chapter, the Night Lords were forced to rely on captured genetic material and improvised implantation procedures that often resulted in failure or the creation of unstable Astartes. The candidates selected for these procedures were typically drawn from the criminal populations of conquered worlds, individuals whose psychological profiles matched the requirements for Night Lords operations, but whose loyalty was questionable at best. The quality of these recruits varied dramatically depending on the resources available to individual warbands and the expertise of their apothecaries. Some groups maintained relatively high standards, selecting only candidates who demonstrated the psychological resilience and tactical intelligence necessary for effective terror operations. Others accepted virtually anyone who survived the implantation process, creating Astartes whose capabilities were significantly below the standards of their predecessors. The resulting diversity in quality and capability among Night Lords' forces made them unpredictable opponents whose effectiveness could vary dramatically from one engagement to another. The technological resources available to Night Lords warbands were similarly inconsistent, with some groups maintaining fleets of well-equipped vessels, while others operated from a single damaged cruiser or even commandeered civilian ships. The most successful warbands established relationships with rogue tech adepts and heretical forge worlds, trading captured Imperial technology and genetic material for weapons, armor, and ship repairs. These arrangements often involved the Night Lords providing security for illegal research projects or eliminating rivals of their technological benefactors, creating a network of mutual dependence that extended their operational capabilities. The development of specialized terror weapons and equipment became a particular focus for Night Lord's artificers, who created devices designed to maximize psychological impact rather than simple lethality. These innovations included sonic weapons that could induce specific phobias in their targets, chemical agents that enhanced the fear response in human nervous systems, and modified bolt rounds that produced distinctive visual and auditory effects when detonated. The psychological conditioning equipment used by the Night Lords was similarly specialized, incorporating techniques borrowed from Imperial interrogation methods and Xenos torture devices to create more effective means of extracting information and breaking enemy morale. The philosophical debates that emerged within the scattered Night Lords' warbands reflected the fundamental questions raised by their Primarch's life and death. The central tension between justice and vengeance, which had tormented Curze throughout his existence, became the defining characteristic of post-Heresy Night Lords culture. Some commanders argued that their operations should maintain some connection to their original mission of eliminating corruption and protecting the innocent, even if their methods remained brutal. These leaders viewed themselves as continuing Curze's work of exposing the hypocrisy of imperial institutions and punishing those who preyed upon the weak. The opposing philosophical faction embraced vengeance as an end in itself, arguing that the Imperium's betrayal of the Night Lords justified any level of retaliation against imperial targets. These warbands conducted operations that seemed designed purely to inflict suffering on imperial populations, viewing the pain they caused as justified retribution for the persecution their legion had endured. The psychological conditioning that had once focused their violence on specific targets had been replaced by a generalized hatred of imperial authority and everything it represented. The theological implications of Curze's prophetic abilities became another source of division within the Night Lords, with some warbands treating his visions as divine revelation, while others dismissed them as the products of a diseased mind. The accuracy of many of his predictions, including his own death and the eventual stagnation of the Imperium, lent credence to those who viewed him as a prophet of inevitable doom. These groups often incorporated elements of fatalistic worship into their operations, viewing themselves as instruments of destiny rather than independent agents. The rituals they developed around the interpretation of Curze's recorded prophecies became elaborate ceremonies that consumed significant time and resources, while providing psychological comfort to warriors who had lost faith in their ability to change the galaxy's fate. The impact of Night Lords' activities in the 41st millennium extends far beyond the immediate destruction they caused to encompass the psychological and cultural effects of their continued existence. The knowledge that entire worlds can be terrorized by a handful of renegade space marines has created a climate of fear that influences imperial policy at every level. Planetary governors implement increasingly draconian security measures in response to the possibility of Night Lords' infiltration, often creating the very conditions of oppression and corruption that make their worlds attractive targets for terror operations. The imperial response to Night Lords' activities has evolved significantly since the immediate post-Heresy period, incorporating lessons learned from decades of counterinsurgency operations against various chaos forces. The establishment of specialized hunter-killer units trained specifically to combat Night Lords' tactics has proven partially effective, though the scattered nature of Night Lords' operations makes it impossible to eliminate the threat entirely. These specialized forces employ psychological conditioning techniques designed to resist fear-based attacks and tactical doctrines that emphasize rapid response and overwhelming firepower to negate the Night Lords' advantages in stealth and terror. The recruitment of new Imperial forces has been complicated by the need to screen candidates for psychological vulnerabilities that might be exploited by Night Lords' operations. The extensive psychological testing required to identify individuals with the mental resilience necessary to resist terror tactics has created bottlenecks in the Imperial military recruitment process, while still failing to eliminate all potential weaknesses. The result is a military establishment that is simultaneously more selective and more paranoid than its predecessors, with training programs that emphasize mental conditioning as much as tactical competence. The cultural impact of Night Lords' activities extends to the civilian populations of Imperial worlds, where the mere possibility of terror attacks has created changes in behavior and social organization. The development of local defense militias and vigilante groups represents an attempt by Imperial citizens to protect themselves from threats that official forces cannot always prevent. These civilian organizations often adopt methods and attitudes that mirror those of the Night Lords themselves, creating a cycle of violence and paranoia that spreads far beyond the immediate targets of terror operations. The theological implications of the Night Lords' continued existence have created challenges for the Imperial cult, which must reconcile the reality of renegade space marines with the doctrine of the Emperor's protection. The development of new prayers and rituals designed to ward off the influence of terror attacks has become a growth industry within the ecclesiarchy, with entire orders of priests specializing in the psychological counseling of terror attack survivors. The theological debates surrounding the nature of fear and its role in human spirituality have produced volumes of doctrinal literature that attempts to provide meaning for experiences that challenge the fundamental assumptions of Imperial faith. The Long War, the eternal conflict between chaos forces and the Imperium that has defined the 41st millennium, has provided the Night Lords with both opportunities and challenges that have shaped their evolution as a fighting force. The constant warfare that characterizes this period has created numerous targets for terror operations, while simultaneously hardening Imperial forces against the psychological tactics that were once devastatingly effective. The Night Lords have been forced to adapt their methods to remain relevant in a galaxy where violence and suffering have become commonplace, developing new techniques that can shock populations already inured to the horrors of eternal war. The relationship between Night Lords' warbands and other chaos forces remains complex and often antagonistic, reflecting the Legion's rejection of the religious aspects of chaos worship while maintaining their opposition to Imperial authority. The Night Lords' nihilistic philosophy and their focus on psychological warfare rather than demonic corruption make them unreliable allies for other traitor legions, who often view them as useful tools rather than trusted partners. The resulting tensions have led to conflicts between Night Lords and other chaos forces that sometimes benefit Imperial defenders more than either side in the struggle. The technological evolution of Night Lords' equipment and tactics has been driven by the need to remain effective against increasingly sophisticated Imperial defenses. The development of new stealth technologies, advanced psychological warfare techniques, and specialized terror weapons has required the Night Lords to maintain relationships with heretical tech adepts and alien technology brokers. These arrangements often involve the Night Lords providing security for illegal research projects or eliminating rivals of their technological benefactors, creating a network of mutual dependence that extends their operational capabilities while exposing them to new forms of corruption and manipulation. The enduring influence of Konrad Curze's nihilistic worldview on his Gene sons manifests in their continued existence as agents of terror rather than warriors fighting for any positive vision of the future. The Night Lords' rejection of hope and their embrace of inevitable doom as a philosophical framework has created a unique form of chaos corruption that does not rely on demonic influence or religious fervor. This psychological corruption is perhaps more insidious than the spiritual corruption that affects other traitor legions, as it represents a complete abandonment of the values that once motivated the Space Marine project while maintaining the technical competence necessary for effective military operations. The recruitment and training of new Night Lords continues to reflect their founders' emphasis on psychological conditioning and the systematic elimination of moral constraints. The initiation rituals employed by Night Lords' warbands are designed to break down the psychological barriers that prevent normal humans from committing atrocities, creating Astartes who are capable of inflicting suffering without experiencing the emotional trauma that would affect unmodified individuals. The effectiveness of these conditioning techniques has been demonstrated repeatedly through the actions of Night Lord's forces, whose capacity for systematic cruelty continues to shock even veteran Imperial commanders who have witnessed the worst excesses of the Long War. The legacy of the Night Haunter extends beyond his immediate gene sons to influence the broader development of Imperial military doctrine and psychological warfare techniques. The methods pioneered by the Night Lords have been studied and adapted by various Imperial agencies, including the Officio Assassinorum and the Inquisition, who have incorporated elements of terror tactics into their own operations. The irony that the Imperium has been forced to adopt the methods of its enemies in order to combat them has not been lost on Imperial philosophers, who debate the moral implications of using fear and intimidation as tools of Imperial policy. The ultimate fate of the Night Lord's Legion remains uncertain, as their scattered nature and adaptive capabilities make them extremely difficult to eliminate entirely. The fragmentation that followed Curze's death has created a situation where the complete destruction of the Legion would require the systematic hunting down of hundreds of individual warbands scattered across the galaxy. The resources required for such an undertaking would be enormous, and the strategic value of eliminating the Night Lords must be weighed against the opportunity costs of deploying those resources against other threats to Imperial security. The philosophical questions raised by the Night Lord's continued existence extend beyond military considerations to encompass fundamental issues about the nature of justice, the role of fear in human society, and the price of maintaining order in a hostile galaxy. The Night Lords represent a dark mirror of Imperial authority, demonstrating the potential consequences of abandoning moral constraints in pursuit of security and control. Their legacy serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing the methods used to combat evil to corrupt those who employ them, creating a cycle of violence and brutality that ultimately serves no constructive purpose. The Night Haunter's vision of inevitable doom and the futility of hope has proven remarkably prescient in the context of the 41st millennium, where the Imperium struggles against enemies that threaten its very existence while being consumed by internal corruption and decay. The Night Lord's nihilistic philosophy offers no solutions to these problems, but their continued existence serves as a constant reminder of the consequences of abandoning the values that once motivated the Great Crusade. In their endless campaign of terror and destruction, the Night Lords have become living monuments to the failure of the Imperial dream and the price of allowing justice to be corrupted by vengeance. The legacy of Konrad Curze and his Night Lords ultimately represents one of the most tragic failures of the Emperor's grand design, a Primarch and Legion that possessed the potential to serve as instruments of justice, but instead became agents of meaningless destruction. Their transformation from protectors of the innocent into predators who feast on fear demonstrates the fragility of moral purpose when confronted with the harsh realities of galactic warfare. As the 41st millennium draws to a close, and the galaxy faces threats that dwarf even the horrors of the Horus Heresy, the Night Lords continue their eternal hunt through the darkness, no longer seeking justice or vengeance, but simply perpetuating the cycle of violence that has consumed their souls and defines their existence in the grim darkness of the far future.